I pulled up to my little brother's lavish wedding, genuinely happy for him, until I looked at my seat card. It read, "Broke-ass sister living off her brother." The bride's family was laughing hysterically. I was about to walk out humiliated when my brother stood up, took my hand, and looked straight at his future father-in-law. "You just made the dumbest and most expensive move of your life." The whole room went quiet. By the next morning, their phones were blowing up and nobody was laughing. My name is Natalie. I am 32 years old, and what my new sister-in-law did not know was that I practically owned her father's company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a toxic family member a very expensive lesson. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Plaza Hotel cast a blinding light over the reception hall. Everything about Dominique's wedding screamed new money. There were ice sculptures of swans, thousands of imported white orchids, and a six-tier cake wrapped in edible gold leaf. I walked into the ballroom wearing a simple, off-the-rack navy dress. It was clean, elegant, and entirely appropriate, but in a room full of heavily beaded designer gowns and flashy tailored tuxedos, I stood out like a sore thumb. That was exactly what my mother Catherine and my soon-to-be sister-in-law, Dominique, wanted. They wanted me to look small. For years, my mother had treated me as the family disappointment, while my younger brother Leo was celebrated for landing a comfortable job in middle management. My career was constantly belittled. I worked in finance, which my mother always summarized to her country club friends as me being a low-level bank clerk counting pennies. The truth was, I am a senior investment director at a top-tier Wall Street private equity firm. I manage portfolios worth billions. I drive a reliable 5-year-old sedan and live in a modest apartment because I do not feel the need to flaunt my wealth. But to my status-obsessed parents, visibility was everything. If you did not wear a heavy diamond necklace or drive a luxury sports car, you were a failure. I navigated through the sea of guests, holding a small clutch, searching for my name at the family tables. Dominique's family, the affluent and supposedly elite owners of Vanguard Logistics, occupied the prime tables surrounding the dance floor. Dominique, a striking African-American woman in a custom gown that easily cost $40,000, was holding court at the head table. She had always been arrogant, manipulative, and deeply obsessed with her family's social standing. From the day Leo introduced us, she made it clear she thought my family was beneath hers, and she treated me like absolute dirt. I approached the head table, expecting to find my name next to my parents'. Instead, I saw a heavy cardstock placeholder right at the end of the table closest to the kitchen doors. As I leaned in to read the elegant gold calligraphy, my blood ran cold. The card did not say Natalie. It said broke-ass sister living off her brother. A sharp, cruel burst of laughter erupted from Dominique's direction. I looked up to see the bride and her 4 bridesmaids pointing directly at me, covering their mouths as they giggled hysterically. They had been waiting for this exact moment. I stood frozen, the harsh words burning into my vision. Before I could even process the humiliation, a heavy hand clapped onto my shoulder. It was Richard, Dominique's father, and the CEO of Vanguard Logistics. He was holding a glass of expensive scotch, looking me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "Excuse me, sweetheart," Richard said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "The catering staff is supposed to use the back entrance. Can someone get this girl a tray to hold? She looks a little lost." More laughter rippled through the crowd. My face burned hot. I looked over at my mother Catherine, hoping for a shred of defense. Instead, my mother glared at me, her face pale with embarrassment, not for me but for herself. "Natalie, for heaven's sake, sit down and hide that card," Catherine hissed, leaning across the table and grabbing my wrist with sharp fingernails. "I told you to buy a real dress for tonight. You embarrass us showing up looking like you just got off a shift at the bank. Do not cause a scene in front of Richard and his associates. They are important people." Important people. I looked at Richard, a man who projected immense wealth, but whose company Vanguard Logistics had been hemorrhaging money for 3 consecutive quarters. I knew this because my private equity firm had been quietly buying up his toxic debt. He was swimming in shark-infested waters, and he did not even know that I was the biggest shark in the ocean. I guess Leo's charity cases extend to his own blood, Richard sneered, taking another sip of his scotch. It is fine, Catherine. We are happy to feed the less fortunate at our daughter's wedding. Just make sure she does not try to take any of the centerpieces home to sell. Dominique leaned over, a vicious smile playing on her lips. Honestly, Natalie, I was going to put you at the children's table, but Leo insisted you sit with the adults. I figured the seat card would at least remind you of your place. You are lucky I even let you into this venue. The cruelty was so casual, so completely enabled by my own mother sitting right next to her. I had spent my entire life biting my tongue to keep the peace. I had endured the snide comments about my modest lifestyle. I had tolerated my parents worshipping Dominique's family because of their flashy cars and name-dropping. But looking at that gold calligraphy surrounded by the mocking laughter of people whose financial survival rested entirely in the palm of my hand, I reached my limit. I did not scream. I did not cry. I calmly picked up the card, stared directly into Dominique's gloating eyes, and dropped it onto her pristine white plate. You are absolutely right, Dominique, I said, my voice steady and cold. I do not belong at this table. Enjoy your evening. I turned on my heel, ready to walk out of the ballroom, walk out of the venue, and walk out of their lives completely. I was already mentally drafting the email to my risk management team to freeze every single asset Vanguard Logistics had tied to our firm. But before I could take a third step toward the exit, a hand clamped down on my wrist. It was not my mother this time. I turned around to see Leo. My younger brother had just returned from the bar. He was staring at the seat card resting on Dominique's plate. The cheerful, easygoing groom, who had spent the last year bending over backward to accommodate Dominique's every absurd demand, was gone. His face was dark with an absolute terrifying rage. The silence that fell over our section of the room was immediate and suffocating. Leo's knuckles turned white. I could see the muscles in his jaw ticking as he processed the cruel joke played on his sister. He had always known Dominique could be difficult, but he had blinded himself to her true nature out of love. He had defended her when she demanded an impossibly expensive engagement ring, and he had worked overtime to help pay for a venue that was completely outside his budget. But seeing my profound humiliation orchestrated as a dinner party game was the final straw that shattered his illusion. Leo, honey. Dominique started, her voice suddenly losing its venomous edge and dropping into a sweet, placating tone. It is just a harmless joke. Natalie has no sense of humor. Tell her to sit down so we can enjoy the toasts. My mother nodded frantically. Leo, sit. Everyone is watching us. Do not ruin this night over your sister's sensitivity. Leo did not sit down. His grip on my wrist tightened, anchoring me to his side as a storm brewed in his eyes. Leo released my wrist. He did not say a single word to my mother. Instead, he reached across the pristine white tablecloth, picked up his crystal champagne flute, and hurled it straight past Richard's head. The glass shattered violently against the ornate ballroom wall. The sharp crash echoed through the massive hall, instantly silencing the remaining giggles from the bridesmaids and the low murmurs of the 200 guests. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. Dominique shrieked, jumping back so fast her chair tipped over and hit the floor with a loud thud. Richard spilled his expensive scotch down his tailored tuxedo front, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. My mother gasped, covering her mouth in horror, while my father Thomas half stood from his seat nearby, looking completely paralyzed by the sudden eruption of violence. Leo ignored their shock. He marched directly to the center of the head table, grabbed the microphone set up for the best man's toast, and switched it on. The feedback whined sharply, making several guests in the front row wince and cover their ears. I spent the last year, Leo's voice boomed through the massive speakers, cold and utterly unrecognizable, bending over backward to prove I was worthy of joining this family. I drained my savings to pay for my half of this ridiculous venue. I took extra shifts to afford that massive diamond on your finger, Dominique. I smiled and nodded while your father talked down to me at every Sunday dinner. I swallowed every insult, every snide comment, and every passive-aggressive jab because I thought I loved you. Leo, have you lost your mind? Richard bellowed, stepping toward him with his fists clenched. "You do not throw tantrums in front of my investors. You do not disrespect my daughter at her own wedding." "Sit down, Richard," Leo snapped, pointing a steady finger directly at his chest. The sheer authority in my younger brother's voice made the older CEO freeze in his tracks. "You want to talk about investors? You want to talk about wealth and class? You are standing here mocking the only person in this room who actually knows what real hard work looks like." Leo turned his intense gaze to Dominique, who was shaking with fury. "Natalie paid my rent when I was struggling in college. She bought my first car so I could get to work. While our parents were busy maxing out their credit cards to look rich for their country club friends. Natalie was building an actual career. She is worth 10 of you, Dominique. She is worth 10 of this entire room combined. Are you choosing this low-level bank clerk over me?" Dominique shrieked, her perfectly contoured face twisting into an ugly, hateful snarl. "She ruined the aesthetic of my wedding just by walking in with that cheap dress. I did her a massive favor by even letting her stay in this building." Catherine, my mother, rushed forward frantically, grabbing Leo's arm, her eyes wide with desperation. "Leo, stop this immediately. Apologize to Richard. Apologize to Dominique right now. You are throwing away your entire future over a stupid piece of cardboard. Do you know who these people are?" Leo shook her hand off his arm with a look of profound disgust. "My future? You mean a future tied to a family of arrogant frauds? A future where I have to watch my wife humiliate my own sister for sport, while you stand there and applaud them for it?" He looked straight at Richard, who was now frantically signaling the hotel security guards standing near the exits. Then Leo looked back at Dominique, who was clutching her ruined veil, fuming with righteous indignation and entitlement. Leo raised the microphone closer to his mouth. His eyes were dead calm, devoid of any hesitation or regret. "You just made the dumbest and most expensive move of your life." He did not explain the hidden weight behind those words. He did not elaborate on the financial win hanging over Richard's logistics empire. He simply dropped the microphone onto the hardwood table with a heavy final thud. He reached up, grabbed the custom-imported orchid boutonniere pinned to his lapel and tore it off his jacket. He tossed the crushed white flower directly onto Dominique's pristine plate, right next to the insulting gold calligraphy seat card. "The wedding is off," Leo stated clearly. He walked over to me, grabbed my hand firmly, and pulled me toward the grand double doors of the ballroom. I walked beside him, my spine straight, my head held high, feeling a massive surge of pride for the brother I had helped raise. The sea of wealthy guests parted for us, their faces a chaotic mix of shock, outrage, and confusion. The security guards Richard had summoned took one look at Leo's furious expression and decided to step back, letting us pass unimpeded. As we reached the main exit, Dominique's voice pierced through the stunned silence of the ballroom. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, her carefully crafted, elegant persona completely shattered, revealing the petty, vicious manipulator underneath. "Walk away, then!" Dominique shrieked, her shrill voice echoing off the marble floors and bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. "You will be back, Leo. You will come crawling back to me by tomorrow morning. And when you do, I will make you beg on your knees for forgiveness. You are throwing away a high-class lifestyle for a worthless spinster who cannot even afford a decent designer dress. She is a nobody. You are absolutely nothing without my father's connections." We pushed through the heavy wooden doors, leaving her manic screaming trapped behind us. She stood there furious and gloating, entirely unaware of the absolute financial destruction that was about to rain down on her family. The heavy oak doors of the Grand Plaza Hotel slammed shut behind us, cutting off Dominique's shrill voice. The cool night air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom. I kept my grip on Leo's hand as we marched across the manicured courtyard toward the valet parking area. My pulse was pounding not from fear, but from a potent mix of adrenaline and long-overdue vindication. Leo was breathing heavily beside me. He unbuttoned his collar, tearing off his silk tie and shoving it into his pocket. We had almost reached my 5-year-old sedan parked at the far end of the lot, when the sound of frantic clicking heels echoed on the pavement behind us. "Natalie, Leo, stop walking this instant." It was my mother. Catherine was practically sprinting across the asphalt, her expensive satin gown hiked up to her knees. My father Thomas was trailing close behind her, his face flushed red with exertion and rage. I stopped and turned around, letting go of Leo's hand. I had spent 32 years shrinking myself to fit into their narrow, status-obsessed worldview. Tonight that ended. Catherine reached us, gasping for breath. She did not look at Leo. She marched straight up to me and pointed a trembling manicured finger an inch from my face. "You ruined everything," Catherine hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You just had to make this night about you, did you not? You could not stand seeing your brother marry into a family of actual substance. You walked in here with your poverty aura wearing that pathetic cheap dress, and you humiliated us in front of the most important people in this city." I stared at her completely unfazed. A poverty aura. That was a new one even for her. "I did not write that seat card, Mom," I said calmly. "Your future daughter-in-law decided to use her wedding reception to publicly degrade me. I simply removed myself from the situation." Thomas stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You provoked her by showing up looking like a peasant," he barked. "Dominique's family has class. They operate a massive national supply chain. They have real wealth. Richard was generous enough to let you attend, and you threw his hospitality right back in his face. You are going to turn around right now, march back into that ballroom, and you are going to get on your knees and apologize to Dominique." I almost laughed. "Get on my knees." "Yes," Catherine shrieked. "You will beg for her forgiveness. You will tell Richard that you are a bitter, jealous spinster who cannot handle her brother's success. If you do not fix this disaster, Natalie, we will never speak to you again. We will cut you out of this family forever." They were threatening me with the very thing I had been craving for years: absolute freedom from their toxic, superficial judgments. Before I could reply, Leo stepped between me and our parents. His chest was heaving. He looked at the two people who raised us as if they were complete strangers. "Do not you dare speak to her like that," Leo roared. The raw fury in his voice made Thomas take an involuntary step back. "She is not apologizing to anyone. Natalie is the only person in this family who actually lives in reality. You two are so blinded by Richard's leased sports cars and Dominique's fake designer bags that you cannot see they are drowning in debt." Catherine scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "You are hysterical, Leo. Dominique comes from a logistics empire. They are corporate royalty compared to us. Do not let your sister's toxic jealousy poison your mind." Royalty. Leo laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed across the empty parking lot. "They are broke, Mom. They are completely, utterly broke." Thomas crossed his arms. "That is an absurd lie." "Is it?" Leo challenged, pulling his smartphone from his pocket. "Let me tell you a little secret about your precious elite daughter-in-law. 3 months ago, Dominique came to me crying hysterically. She said her father's company had a temporary cash flow issue and her personal accounts were frozen. She was terrified her bridesmaids would find out she was broke before the wedding." I watched Leo, genuinely surprised. He had never mentioned this financial bailout to me. "She had $80,000 in secret credit card debt." Leo continued, his voice shaking with betrayal. $80,000 spent on shoes, vacations, and dinners just to maintain her fake influencer lifestyle. The banks were about to sue her, so I took the money I had been saving for a house down payment. The money Natalie helped me invest. I liquidated it and paid off Dominique's debt so she would not face fraud charges. Catherine's face drained of color. "You paid off her debt?" "Yes," Leo spat. "She told me Richard would pay me back the moment his quarterly corporate dividends cleared. But guess what? I saw Richard's phone buzzing at the bar tonight. It was a commercial collection agency. Vanguard Logistics is not an empire. It is a sinking ship. Dominique has been using my bank account to fund her luxury wedding aesthetic while treating my sister like garbage. The wedding is over. I am done." Thomas shook his head, retreating into aggressive denial. "No. No, you are misunderstanding a simple corporate liquidity issue. Businesses have leverage ratios, Leo. You are throwing away a golden opportunity because Natalie has infected you with her loser mentality. You need to go back inside and fix this." I looked at my parents. They were presented with hard, undeniable facts about Dominique's financial manipulation, And they still chose the illusion of wealth over their own children. They were beyond saving. They had made their choice, and now they would have to live with the consequences. I stepped around Leo and looked directly into my mother's eyes. You want to see what real wealth looks like, Mom. You want to see what happens when you cross the person you have spent 32 years underestimating. Watch the morning news. I pulled my smartphone out of my clutch. The screen glowed brightly in the dark parking lot. I opened my secure corporate messaging app, navigating straight to the private channel for my risk management and acquisitions team at my private equity firm. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision. The power I had kept hidden for years was finally slipping off its leash. The message was simple, cold, and final. Execute Order 66 on Vanguard Logistics. Call in the entire debt immediately. Freeze all secondary assets. No negotiations. I hit send. The confirmation receipt flashed on my screen instantly. Order received. Lockout protocols initiated. I slid my phone back into my clutch and walked to my car, leaving my parents standing in the cold parking lot, still clinging to the illusion of a billionaire family that was about to be eradicated. I did not sleep that night. I drove straight to my apartment, changed into a tailored charcoal suit, and headed directly to the executive penthouse suite of Apex Holdings. By 5 in the morning, I was standing in front of the glass windows of my corner office, watching the city skyline wake up. On my massive desk, 3 monitors glowed with the financial data of Vanguard Logistics. Richard liked to project the image of a self-made logistics king, but his entire empire was built on a fragile house of cards. He was over-leveraged, bleeding cash, and entirely dependent on a $50 million emergency bridge loan to make payroll by the end of the week. And Apex Holdings held the keys to that bridge loan. Specifically, I held the keys. At exactly 6 in the morning, the automated banking clearinghouses updated their daily ledgers. I watched the green numbers on my screen turn a violently harsh red. The trap snapped shut. Across the city, Richard was violently jolted awake by the ringing of his cell phone. I knew the exact timeline because my risk management lead, David, was standing right next to me reading the real-time banking flags aloud. Vanguard accounts are officially frozen, David reported, tapping his tablet. The bridge loan distribution has been intercepted and cancelled. All secondary vendor payment lines are returning insufficient funds. They are completely locked out of the financial system. I smiled coldly, taking a slow sip of my black coffee. Let them burn. At that exact moment, Dominique was experiencing her own financial apocalypse. She had spent the night fuming in a luxury hotel suite she booked using her father's corporate account, fully expecting Leo to come crawling back with a groveling apology. When she woke up, she decided to treat herself to a $5,000 online shopping spree to soothe her damaged ego. She entered her father's black card information. It declined. She tried another card. Declined. She tried the emergency corporate platinum account. Declined. Dominique threw her phone across the hotel bed, screaming in frustration. She dialed her father, ready to throw a massive tantrum about the banks making a stupid error on her special weekend. But Richard was not in the mood to coddle his spoiled daughter. He was standing in his home office, staring at a laptop screen displaying flashing red notifications from his primary commercial lender. Access denied. Account frozen pending covenant review. Richard frantically dialed his elite banking representative, screaming into the receiver about lawsuits and his supposed immense wealth. He demanded the immediate release of all his funds, threatening to pull his non-existent billions out of their institution. The banking representative simply read from a legally mandated script. Vanguard Logistics had breached the core insolvency clauses of their debt restructuring agreement. The emergency bridge loan was terminated. All corporate liquidity was seized. I watched the dominoes fall from my office, the satisfaction buzzing through my veins. For years, I had listened to Richard boast at Sunday dinners about his business acumen. I had watched him treat my brother like an obedient servant, while Dominique mocked my sensible shoes. They thought wealth was a costume you could wear to intimidate people. They had no idea that real wealth operates in the shadows, silent, ruthless, and absolute. My desk phone buzzed. It was the internal line from the Apex Holdings legal department. The team confirmed that the breach of contract notices had been officially delivered to Richard's executive inbox. The digital paper trail was flawless. Vanguard Logistics was now in technical default. If Richard could not produce $50 million in cash by the end of the business day, his company would be forced into involuntary bankruptcy and his assets liquidated to pay us back. How is a dead man walking? Back in his mansion. Richard was sweating profusely, his expensive silk pajamas clinging to his chest. He paced the floor of his office, his mind racing for a solution. He thought he could secure a quick temporary loan from one of his country club friends. But the financial world is incredibly small and bad news travels faster than light. The moment Apex Holdings flagged his accounts, his credit rating plunged into the abyss. Nobody was going to lend a single cent to a man whose company was actively being seized by Wall Street predators. Suddenly, Richard's phone rang again. He snatched it up, expecting his banking representative to apologize for a computer glitch. Instead, it was his chief financial officer. The CFO sounded like he was on the verge of a massive heart attack. Richard, the CFO, gasped in sheer panic. "You need to get to the office right now. The banks just locked us out of everything. Payroll is bouncing. Trucking vendors are threatening to halt all shipments immediately. We have zero liquidity." "What are you talking about?" Richard bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "Call the private equity firm handling our debt restructuring. Tell them to release the bridge loan immediately before I sue them into oblivion." "You do not understand," Richard, the CFO, cried out. "Apex Holdings is the firm that just pulled the plug. They own our debt. They just invoked the default penalty." The senior director of their risk management division sent over an official legal mandate. "They are demanding an immediate forensic audit of all our financial records by noon today, or they are seizing the entire company." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "Who is the senior director?" "I do not know," the CFO stammered in absolute terror, struggling to speak the words. "The signature on the legal mandate just says Natalie." Dominique slammed the door of her luxury ride, her heels clicking furiously against the concrete pavement outside Leo's apartment building. It was barely 7 in the morning. She had spent the entire night pacing her hotel suite, fueled by room service champagne and blinding rage. She was absolutely certain of how this morning would play out. She expected to unlock Leo's front door and find him sitting on the couch, head in his hands, ready to beg for her forgiveness. She was going to make him crawl. She was going to demand he drain whatever pathetic savings he had left to compensate for the emotional distress his sister caused. She jammed her key into the lock and shoved the door open. "Leo," she barked, marching straight into the living room. "I hope you are ready to grovel because my father is furious and I am humiliated." Leo was not crying. He was not sitting on the couch holding his head in his hands. He was standing in the middle of the living room, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, calmly tossing a pair of her expensive designer heels into a heavy-duty black trash bag. "What are you doing?" Dominique shrieked, her perfectly manicured hands flying to her face. "Those are custom Italian leather. Put them down right now." Leo did not even flinch. He dropped the shoes into the plastic bag, grabbed a handful of her silk blouses from the nearby armchair, and stuffed them in right on top. "I am packing," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "You need to be out of my apartment by 8. I already called the building manager to revoke your keycard access." Dominique let out a harsh, incredulous laugh, crossing her arms over her chest. "Are you serious right now? You humiliate me in front of 200 of the most important people in the city. You ruin my perfect wedding, and now you think you can kick me out of an apartment I helped decorate. You are out of your mind. You are going to fix this, Leo. You are going to pick up your phone, call your loser sister, and tell her she owes my family a massive check." Leo pulled a zip tie from his pocket and yanked it tight around the neck of the trash bag. "Natalie owes you absolutely nothing. She owes us for the venue," Dominique screamed, stepping closer and jabbing her finger toward his chest. "She owes us for the ruined 6-tier cake, the imported flowers, and the public embarrassment. She marched into my reception looking like cheap trash and ruined the aesthetic of my entire night. I want her bank account emptied to pay for this. Make her take out a loan. Make your pathetic parents take out a second mortgage. I do not care. You will make them pay for crossing my family." Leo dragged the heavy trash bag to the front door and dropped it on the hardwood floor with a loud thud. He turned around, walking slowly back toward the kitchen counter. He picked up a thick stack of stapled papers and held them up in the morning light. You want to talk about money, Dominique? You want to talk about who owes who? Let us talk about this little document I found buried in your email outbox last night while I was logging out of our shared devices. Dominique froze. The arrogant fire in her eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a sudden sharp panic. What is that? She demanded, her voice losing its shrill edge. It is the revised prenuptial agreement, Leo said, slapping the papers hard against the kitchen island. The one you told me your father's lawyers were still drafting. The one you swore was just a standard formality to protect Vanguard Logistics. Funny thing about this version, Dominique. It includes a highly specific hidden clause buried on page 42. Dominique took a step back, her mouth opening and closing as she scrambled for an excuse. You were not supposed to read that. It is just legal jargon. My father insisted on it. Legal jargon. Leo laughed coldly. It is a predatory asset trap. You drafted a clause stating that in the event of a divorce, you would not only secure alimony, but also retain full equity rights to any intellectual property or patents I develop at my engineering firm. You were planning to steal my future earnings while completely shielding your father's supposedly massive wealth in an untouchable offshore trust. You were setting me up to be your financial hostage. That is standard for high net worth families. Dominique lied, her voice rising in defensive panic. We have assets to protect. You are just a middle manager. You should be grateful I was willing to elevate your social status. You do not have any assets, Leo roared, slamming his fist on the counter. The sudden noise made Dominique flinch. You have $80,000 in secret credit card debt that I stupidly paid off. Your father's company is bleeding cash. You are a fraud, Dominique. Your entire life is a smokescreen of leased cars and borrowed money. You tried to trap me legally because you knew the Vanguard Logistics money was running out. I am warning you! Leo, Dominique hissed, her face contorting into an ugly sneer. You do not talk about my father's company like that. Vanguard is an empire. Vanguard is a sinking ship, Leo retorted, grabbing her second suitcase by the handle and rolling it aggressively toward the front door. And I am getting off right now. Take your trash bags. Take your fake designer bags. Get out of my apartment and do not ever come back. He shoved the rolling suitcase toward her. It hit her shins, forcing her to stumble backward into the hallway. You cannot do this to me, Dominique screamed, her composure completely shattering as she realized Leo was actually throwing her out. I am Dominique. People beg to be in my presence. I gave you the best year of your pathetic, mediocre life. You gave me a masterclass in manipulation, Leo said, standing in the doorway, his hand resting firmly on the doorknob. And I am officially unenrolled. Goodbye, Dominique. Leo began to push the heavy door shut, but Dominique slammed her hands against the wood, her eyes wide with a frantic, vicious desperation. She was losing control, and it made her vicious. If you close this door, I will destroy you. Dominique threatened, her voice echoing loudly down the quiet apartment building hallway. You think you can just walk away from me? You think your little engineering career means anything? My father has powerful connections in this city. He knows every corporate board member, every major investor, and every CEO. I will make sure he blacklists you from every firm on the West Coast. Leo stared at her, completely unfazed by her screaming. I will ruin your career, Leo, she shrieked, tears of pure rage spilling down her cheeks. By tomorrow morning, you will not even be able to get a job pouring coffee. I will make a single phone call to my father, and Vanguard Logistics will crush you and your pathetic broke sister. Leo looked at the woman he had almost married. He felt no sadness, only a profound sense of relief. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. You go ahead and call your father, Dominique, Leo said quietly. Ask him how Vanguard Logistics is doing this morning. I think he is going to be a little too busy to worry about my career. He shoved the door forward, ignoring her frantic shrieks. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a solid, satisfying thud, locking her out completely. Dominique stood in the hallway alone, surrounded by trash bags full of her clothes, screaming curses at the closed door. She furiously dug her cell phone out of her purse, her fingers trembling with rage as she dialed her father's private number. She was going to demand he destroy Leo. She was going to unleash the full power of her family's wealth. She had absolutely no idea that her father was currently standing in his home office, staring at a notice of corporate seizure, sweating in pure terror, because the empire she was threatening to use against Leo no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Natalie. By 8 in the morning, the financial bloodbath I orchestrated from my penthouse office was fully automated. Vanguard Logistics was officially paralyzed. Leaving my risk management team to monitor the incoming panic from Richard's executives, I grabbed my coat and drove back to my modest apartment to shower and change. The media storm would hit soon, and I needed to gather some personal documents before the press realized who exactly was pulling the strings at Apex Holdings. I had barely stepped out of the shower and tied a silk robe around my waist when a violent, frantic pounding echoed through my apartment. "Natalie, open this door right now." It was my father. Thomas was hammering on the thin wood of my front door, accompanied by the shrill, demanding voice of my mother. "We know you are in there, Natalie. Do not hide from us like a coward. Open the door before we have the building manager break it down." I calmly tightened the belt of my robe, walked through my small living room, and unbolted the lock. The door flew open. Catherine and Thomas barged into my apartment like a heavily armed tactical unit. My mother's hair was disheveled, her designer coat thrown hastily over her shoulders, and her eyes were wild with a mixture of exhaustion and manic rage. My father's face was dark red, a vein visibly pulsing on his forehead. They looked around my simple, unpretentious living room with absolute disgust before turning their fury entirely onto me. "You vicious, jealous little girl," Catherine hissed, stepping into my personal space. "You destroyed everything. Richard called your father at the crack of dawn. Dominique is completely inconsolable. The wedding is cancelled. Leo is refusing to answer our calls, and our family name is officially a laughingstock in the elite circles of this city." I walked past them, heading straight for my small kitchenette. I filled the electric kettle with water and turned it on. "Chamomile or Earl Grey, mother? You look like your blood pressure is currently operating at a dangerous premium." "Do not play games with us," Thomas roared, slamming his hand down on my modest dining table. "You are going to fix this. We just got off the phone with our family lawyer. We are drawing up the paperwork today. We will formally and legally disown you. We will sever all ties, remove you from our wills, and publicly denounce you. You will never see a single dime of our money." I leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms. "Disown me? That implies I have ever taken a single dollar from you since I turned 18. I paid my own way through college, and I paid Leo's rent when you refused to help him. You are threatening to cut me off from a financial supply line that does not exist. Unless you do exactly what we say." Catherine interrupted, her voice trembling with barely contained hysteria. "You are going to march into a bank this morning. You are going to take out a personal loan, and you are going to wire Richard a check to compensate for the ruined venue, the destroyed cake, the imported flowers, and the emotional distress you caused his daughter. You will pay for every single cent of that wedding." The kettle clicked, signaling the water was boiling. I slowly poured the hot water into a ceramic mug, dropping in a tea bag. I stirred it in complete agonizing silence, letting them stew in the absurdity of their own demands. I took a slow sip. "Let me get this straight," I said, my voice eerily calm against their frantic energy. "You have spent the last decade telling your country club friends that I am a low-level bank clerk who counts pennies. You despise my 5-year-old sedan. You loathe this apartment because it lacks marble countertops and vaulted ceilings. Yet you want me to march into a commercial bank today and secure a 6-figure unsecured personal loan to reimburse a man you claim is a billionaire." They stared at me, blinking in unison. "Do you understand how a debt-to-income ratio works, Dad?" I asked, stepping out of the kitchenette and walking toward them. "Because a bank clerk cannot secure a $100,000 loan on a whim. If Richard is a titan of industry, why is he demanding wedding reparations from a supposed peasant? Why did Leo have to liquidate his savings to pay off your beloved Dominique's $80,000 in secret credit card debt? Why are you threatening to disown your own flesh and blood over a catering bill?" Thomas puffed out his chest, trying to regain his authority. "Do not lecture me on finances. Dominique's debt was a simple cash flow error. Richard is just teaching Leo a lesson about respect and consequences. You are deflecting because you are a bitter woman who wants to drag everyone down to your miserable tax bracket. Richard does not have a cash flow error, mother, I said, setting my mug down on the table with a sharp clink. He has a $50 million deficit. Catherine let out a harsh theatrical laugh, tossing her head back in sheer disbelief. $50 million. Listen to yourself. Throwing around corporate numbers you overheard at the water cooler. You know absolutely nothing about corporate logistics. You are a clerk. You are nobody. Richard's company spans the entire West Coast. A legacy of fraudulent invoices and over-leveraged assets. I countered my words, firing back with this precision of a scalpel. Vanguard Logistics has been failing since last year. Richard mortgaged his commercial fleet just to maintain his country club memberships. He is drowning in high-yield corporate debt, and his principal lenders flagged his accounts for severe insolvency at 6 o'clock this morning. You are pathological. Catherine spat, shaking her head in pity. You have completely lost touch with reality. You are making up psychotic fantasies because you cannot handle the fact that Dominique is better than you. Richard is a giant. I picked up the television remote resting on my coffee table. I suppose we will see about that. I pressed the power button. The flat screen flickered to life, already tuned to the premier morning financial news network. Catherine rolled her eyes, preparing to hurl another insult, but the words died in her throat. The bold red breaking news banner flashing across the bottom of the screen caught her attention. The anchor looked dead into the camera, his expression grave. We are interrupting our normal broadcast with breaking news out of the logistics sector. Vanguard Logistics, one of the largest supply chain operators on the West Coast, has officially had all corporate assets frozen. Sources inside the company report a catastrophic liquidity crisis with a $50 million deficit, bringing the company to the brink of involuntary bankruptcy. CEO Richard has not responded to requests for comment as his stock plunges by 40% in pre-market trading. The broadcast cut to a live helicopter shot of Richard's corporate headquarters. Employees were already standing outside the glass building looking panicked as security guards locked the main doors. A picture of Richard's face flashed on the screen, stamped with the word, "Insolvent," in massive block letters. The remote slipped from my hand and hit the table. Catherine stared at the television screen, her mouth hanging wide open in absolute paralyzed horror. Catherine could not breathe. Her eyes darted from the flashing red banner on the screen to my face and back again. The polished, arrogant facade she had worn into my apartment completely evaporated. Thomas grabbed his chest, coughing as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. "This is a trick," Catherine finally gasped, her voice trembling. "This is a fake broadcast. You paid someone to do this." "I paid the premier financial news network to fabricate a federal insolvency report," I replied, crossing my arms. "Do you hear yourself, Mom? Your delusion is reaching a clinical level." Thomas yanked his phone from his pocket and frantically dialed Richard's number. The call went straight to an automated voicemail. He tried again. Same result. The mighty logistics titan was too busy watching his empire burn to answer calls from his prospective in-laws. "Get out of my apartment," I said, pointing toward the door. "You came here to disown me. Consider it done. Go find your billionaire best friend and see if he still wants to play country club with you." Thomas grabbed Catherine's arm, dragging her toward the hallway. They stumbled out the door, a pair of terrified frauds, realizing they had bet their entire social standing on a sinking ship. I locked the deadbolt behind them and walked back to my coffee, feeling nothing but absolute clarity. Miles away inside the glass walls of Vanguard Logistics, Richard was experiencing a level of panic he had not felt in 30 years. His massive corner office felt like a cage. The phone lines were glowing red. Every single creditor he had spent the last 2 years dodging was calling in their debts simultaneously. His chief financial officer rushed into the room, his tie askew and his face drenched in sweat. "It is a margin call, Richard. Bank of America just issued a formal demand for $12 million by noon to cover our over-leveraged fleet assets. Chase is demanding $8 million. The private equity firm, Apex Holdings, locked out the remaining $30 million. If we do not wire cash to cover the margins in 4 hours, they will trigger the liquidation clauses. They will seize your house, the cars, everything. Richard slammed his fist onto his mahogany desk. "Where is the emergency reserve? You drained it last month to pay for the warehouse leases," the CFO yelled back. "We have zero liquidity. We need hard cash right now, or the feds will be walking through those doors by tomorrow morning." Richard gripped his hair, his mind racing through every wealthy contact in his phone. They were all ignoring him. The news broadcast had labeled him toxic. No bank would touch him. No investor would take his call. He needed private capital, unencumbered family money. His eyes snapped wide open. Leo. Leo's parents, Catherine and Thomas, had spent the entire wedding rehearsal boasting about their elite lineage. They dressed in designer labels, complained about capital gains taxes, and carried themselves like old money aristocrats. Richard had always assumed they were sitting on a massive generational trust fund. If he could leverage the marriage connection, he could secure a short-term personal loan to satisfy the margin call and buy himself 48 hours to restructure. Richard snatched his cell phone and dialed Thomas. Thomas and Catherine were sitting in their leased luxury sedan outside my apartment building, arguing frantically about what to do next. When Thomas saw Richard's name flash on his screen, he nearly dropped the phone. He answered immediately, plastering on a fake, cheerful tone. "Richard, we just saw the news. It must be some terrible misunderstanding." Thomas listened to me very carefully. Richard barked, ignoring the pleasantries. His voice was raw with desperation. "The media is blowing a temporary liquidity crunch way out of proportion. I am dealing with a hostile corporate raid. I need cash to satisfy a margin call and freeze the liquidation process." Thomas swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "A margin call. Well, Richard, I am sure your banking partners will sort it out." "The banks are locked," Richard shouted. "I am coming to you as family Thomas. Dominique and Leo are getting married. Our assets are linked. I need a short-term bridge loan from your family trust. $10 million. Wire it to my holding account by 11 o'clock, and I will pay you back with 20% interest next week." The silence inside the sedan was deafening. Catherine stared at her husband, her face completely drained of blood. $10 million! Thomas squeaked, his voice cracking. "Richard, I cannot just move $10 million on a Tuesday morning." $5 million, then." Richard demanded, the panic bleeding through his authoritative facade. "Drain whatever liquid accounts you have. Tap into your stock portfolios. I will sign over the deed to my estate as collateral. If Vanguard goes down, Dominique loses everything. You have to protect your future daughter-in-law." Thomas was sweating profusely. The illusion he had spent years crafting was violently colliding with reality. He was a retired middle manager. His designer suit was bought on a credit card. He had exactly $42,000 in his retirement savings, and he was currently leasing the car he was sitting in. He did not have $5 million. He did not have $500,000. "Richard, I cannot help you." Thomas stammered, panic overtaking his logic. "My funds are tied up, completely illiquid. I am so sorry." Thomas hung up the phone, breathing heavily. He looked at Catherine, who was shaking her head in horror. They were exposed. The billionaire family they worshipped was begging them for cash, and they had absolutely nothing to offer. In a blind panic, Thomas opened his recent calls list and hit the number for Dominique. He needed to scream at someone. He needed to blame the bride for dragging his son into this catastrophic mess. Across town, Dominique had just arrived at Vanguard Logistics corporate headquarters. She had forced her way past the locked doors, using her executive access card, and stormed straight into her father's office to demand answers about her declined credit cards. She was standing right next to Richard's desk when her phone rang. Seeing Thomas calling, she answered it, putting it on speakerphone so her father could hear Leo's family apologizing to her. "Instead of an apology," Thomas's furious, panicked voice blasted through the executive office. "Dominique, what kind of scam is your father running?" Thomas screamed through the speaker. "He just called me begging for $5 million. I am a retired regional manager living on a fixed pension. I drive a leased car. We do not have a family trust. We do not have millions of dollars sitting in a bank." Dominique froze, her eyes widening as she looked at her father. Richard stopped breathing. "You and your father thought you were marrying into money." Thomas continued to yell, entirely unaware he was on speakerphone in Richard's office. You thought we were loaded because we act like it. But we are broke, Dominique. The only person in our entire family who actually has any real money is Natalie. She is a senior director at Apex Holdings. She manages billions. She is the only one who could write a check that big, and you just spent the last 24 hours calling her a worthless peasant. The line went dead. Dominique stared at her phone, the color completely vanishing from her face. She slowly lifted her head to look at her father. Richard stood frozen behind his mahogany desk. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Apex Holdings, the firm that bought his debt, the firm that triggered the margin call, the legal mandate signed by a senior director named Natalie. The low-level clerk they had publicly humiliated at the wedding was the exact same apex predator currently executing the kill order on his entire life. "That is a lie," Dominique shrieked, shattering the stunned silence in her father's office. "Thomas is lying to cover his own pathetic tracks. Natalie is a broke bank teller who drives a piece of junk sedan. She does not work at Apex Holdings, and she certainly does not manage billions." Richard stared blankly at his computer screen. The flashing red insolvency warnings reflected in his terrified eyes. The name on the digital mandate matched perfectly. He slumped back into his leather chair, the fight completely drained out of him. He was a man who had just watched his entire life vanish into thin air. Dominique snatched her phone from the desk and stomped toward the door. "I am going down there right now. I will expose this ridiculous bluff. I will drag that miserable spinster by her cheap hair and force her to fix my credit cards." She probably broke into her boss's computer. She ignored her father's weak, breathless protests, storming out of the logistics headquarters and throwing herself into her luxury SUV. Her mind raced with frantic, delusional justifications as she sped toward the financial district. Natalie had to be a receptionist, a low-level data entry clerk who somehow accessed the company letterhead. There was no way the woman who wore an off-the-rack dress to a high-society wedding wielded actual corporate power. The idea was physically repulsive to Dominique. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white, determined to put her fiancé's sister back in her rightful place. 20 minutes later, Dominique pulled up to the towering glass and steel monolith of Apex Holdings. The building dominated the city skyline, a pristine fortress of wealth and power that made her father's logistics headquarters look like a dusty warehouse. She abandoned her vehicle in the VIP drop-off zone, ignoring the shouts of the valet, and marched through the revolving doors into the sprawling marble lobby. The reception area was bustling with sharp-suited professionals moving with intense purpose. Dominique bypassed the main security desk, slipping through the secure turnstiles directly behind a group of distracted executives carrying briefcases. She stepped into the polished chrome elevator and scanned the directory. The top floor was simply labeled Executive Boardroom and Senior Directors. She slammed her finger against the button. If Natalie was pretending to be a senior director, that was where Dominique would expose the fraud. The elevator shot upwards, her ears popping as she ascended to the penthouse level. When the doors slid, Dominique stepped out into a completely different world. The top floor was breathtakingly intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire city. Original modern art lined the quiet, hushed corridors. There were no cubicles, only massive glass-walled offices occupied by people moving immense amounts of capital. A sleek, impeccably dressed executive assistant immediately stepped into Dominique's path. "Excuse me, ma'am. This floor requires keycard access. Who are you here to see?" "Get out of my way," Dominique snapped, shoving past the assistant with all the entitled aggression she could muster. "I am looking for Natalie. She is a low-level clerk who works here. Point me to her desk right now before I have my father buy this building and fire you." The assistant blinked, looking utterly bewildered by the sheer audacity. "You are looking for Natalie, our senior investment director. She is not a director." Dominique screamed, her voice echoing down the pristine hallway and causing several heads to turn. "She is a fraud and a liar." Before the assistant could call security, Dominique spotted it. At the very end of the corridor, occupying the most prime real estate in the building, was a massive corner office. Through the soundproof glass walls, she saw a large mahogany desk, digital market boards flashing real-time global financial data, and a woman standing with her back to the door looking out over the city. Dominique did not hesitate. She charged down the hall, threw open the heavy glass door, and barged straight into the office. "You pathetic lying garbage!" Dominique shrieked, slamming the door behind her. "Did you really think you could forge a legal document and get away with it? Did you steal company letterhead just to scare my father? You are going to fix my credit cards right now, or I am calling the police and having you arrested for corporate fraud." The woman turned around slowly. It was Natalie, but she looked absolutely nothing like the woman from the wedding. Gone was the simple, modest dress. Natalie was wearing a $5,000 custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit her with razor-sharp perfection. A vintage luxury watch rested on her wrist, and her posture exuded a terrifying, absolute authority. She looked like a woman who could buy and sell Dominique's entire existence before lunch. Natalie did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at Dominique the way one might look at an insect that had wandered indoors. "You bypassed security, entered a restricted financial institution, and burst into my private office," Natalie said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "Your arrogance is only matched by your sheer, unadulterated stupidity." Dominique felt a sudden icy knot form in her stomach, but she refused to back down. She crossed her arms, jutting her chin forward. "Stop playing dress-up, Natalie. My father is Richard of Vanguard Logistics. We are the elite of this city. You are a bitter, jealous spinster who ruined my wedding because you cannot handle the fact that Leo is marrying up. Now get on your computer, reverse whatever cheap hack you did to my bank accounts, and apologize." Natalie slowly walked around her massive desk. She picked up a sleek silver tablet, tapped a single button, and set it back down on the polished wood. "You are standing in the center of global capital," Dominique, Natalie said smoothly, taking a measured step toward her. "You are screaming about a wedding cake while my firm controls billions in international assets. Your father is not the elite. Your father is a terrible businessman who heavily leveraged his commercial fleet to fund your shopping habits. He borrowed $30 million he could not repay. Apex Holdings bought that debt for pennies on the dollar. I triggered the default clause because Vanguard is financially diseased." "You are lying," Dominique yelled, her voice pitching into a frantic, desperate octave. She backed away as Natalie advanced, the reality of the situation finally beginning to penetrate her delusion. "You are a clerk. You live in a tiny apartment. You cannot do this." The glass office door suddenly swung open. 4 highly trained, heavily armed corporate security guards stormed into the room, instantly surrounding Dominique. They grabbed her arms, pinning them firmly to her sides before she could even react. "Let me go!" Dominique thrashed violently, kicking her designer heels against the floor. "Do you know who I am? Do you know who my father is?" Natalie picked up a thick, officially stamped legal folder from her desk. She walked right up to the struggling, screaming woman. Natalie's expression was utterly devoid of mercy. "I know exactly who your father is," Natalie said softly, holding Dominique's terrified gaze. "And as of this morning, I know exactly what he is worth." Natalie calmly slid a single piece of paper from the folder and tucked it directly into the pocket of Dominique's designer jacket. "That is the official notice of asset seizure for Vanguard Logistics," Natalie whispered. "Tell Richard I will see him at the liquidation hearing." The security guards released Dominique, physically steering her out of the glass office. She stumbled, clutching the folded legal document like it was a live grenade. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind her, sealing me back in my soundproof sanctuary. Through the glass, I watched her manicured hands shake. She did not scream this time. The absolute terrifying reality of that embossed court seal had finally pierced her thick armor of delusion. She turned and fled down the hallway, rushing toward the elevator to escape the stares of my executive assistants. I did not waste a single second watching her leave. I turned back to my monitors and pressed the intercom button. "David, bring the forensic team online right now. I want Vanguard's books completely eviscerated by lunchtime. Leave absolutely nothing standing. Find every hidden account, every fraudulent invoice, and every bad loan." Within minutes, a team of 20 elite forensic accountants began tearing through the digital carcass of Richard's logistics empire. It was a financial massacre. Vanguard was not just a failing company experiencing a temporary cash flow issue. It was a masterclass in corporate fraud. David routed the preliminary findings directly to my main screen. Richard had been cooking the books for over 3 years. He logged empty abandoned warehouses as highly profitable active assets. High inflated the value of his commercial trucking fleet by listing vehicles that had been sold for scrap a decade ago. He was running a ghost ship keeping the lights on by taking out massive predatory loans to cover the interest on his older toxic debts. He was a desperate man playing a dangerous game of financial roulette. While my team dissected her father's criminal incompetence, Dominique was wandering the financial district in a state of hyperventilating denial. She desperately needed to feel superior again. She needed the physical validation of wealth to convince herself that the encounter in my office was just a temporary nightmare that her father would fix by the afternoon. She practically ran into the flagship boutique of a notoriously exclusive European designer, a place where she regularly dropped tens of thousands of dollars to maintain her elite status among her socialite friends. She marched past the velvet ropes, ignoring the greeter entirely, and headed straight for the VIP salon. She demanded the immediate attention of the store manager, pointing a shaking finger at a rare python skin handbag displayed behind bulletproof glass. "Pack it up," Dominique ordered, her voice loud and grating in the quiet, luxurious space. "I am taking it today. I also need 3 pairs of those silk scarves and the matching leather wallet. Hurry up. I have a terrible headache and I do not have time to wait around." The manager, accustomed to her lavish, impulsive spending, quickly wrapped the expensive items, placing them in pristine branded shopping bags. The total came to $22,000. Dominique casually tossed her heavy metal black card onto the glass counter, crossing her arms and looking around the store to ensure the other wealthy patrons were noticing her VIP treatment. The cashier swiped the card. A harsh beep interrupted the soft classical music playing in the boutique. "Declined." The cashier frowned, tapping the touchscreen. "I apologize, ma'am. Let me try that again. Sometimes these metal cards have chip connectivity issues." She wiped it on her sleeve and inserted it into the reader again. Another sharp beep echoed through the quiet room. "It says insufficient funds," the cashier whispered, looking highly uncomfortable. Dominique slammed her hand flat on the counter. "Do you know who I am? Run it again. Your machine is clearly broken. My father is the CEO of Vanguard Logistics. I have a limitless spending ceiling on that account." Other shoppers were turning their heads now. A woman in a tailored designer suit whispered something to her companion, both of them openly staring at Dominique's aggressive meltdown. The store manager quickly stepped in, trying to quietly de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. Do you have another form of payment we can use?" Dominique snatched the black card back and aggressively shoved a gold platinum card across the glass. "Use this one. And I want a discount for this humiliating technical error." The manager swiped the gold card. "Declined. Account frozen." The manager's polite smile completely vanished, replaced by a cold professional boundary. "I am sorry, but all of your accounts are returning severe lockouts. I am going to have to ask you and step out of the VIP area. You are disturbing our actual clients." Dominique's face turned a violent shade of ash. Her chest heaved as she looked at the beautiful shopping bag sitting just out of her reach. She was standing in the middle of a high-end boutique surrounded by the exact social circle she was desperate to impress, and her card had declined like a common teenager overdrawing a checking account. She tried to pull out her phone to call Leo, completely forgetting he had kicked her out. The screen was black. The battery had died. The humiliation was absolute, public, and devastating. She snatched her empty purse and fled the store, running out onto the crowded sidewalk, finally realizing that she was completely, unequivocally broke. Back in my penthouse office, I was reviewing the asset liquidation schedule when David burst through my glass door without knocking. His tie was loose, and he looked at me with an expression of sheer, unprecedented disbelief. He dropped a thick stack of printed ledgers directly onto my keyboard. "Natalie, you need to see this immediately," David said, pointing to a highlighted column of offshore wire transfers. We were tracing the missing bridge loan funds to see where Richard was bleeding the most cash. We expected to find bad investments or aggressive corporate bonuses. But that is not what is draining Vanguard. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted offshore routing numbers. What exactly am I looking at, David? It is a systemic embezzlement ring. David explained, his finger tracing the flow of millions of dollars out of Vanguard's primary operating accounts. For the past 2 years, massive sums of corporate cash have been quietly siphoned off and funneled into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. The shell company issues fake invoices for consulting fees regarding international logistics optimization, and Vanguard pays them blindly every single month. So Richard is stealing from his own company to hide assets before the bankruptcy. I reasoned already, preparing to draft a federal fraud alert to the authorities. No, David said, looking up at me with a grim smile. Richard is entirely clueless. He has been signing off on these invoices because they were authorized and submitted by his daughter's executive account. We tracked the IP addresses and the ultimate beneficiary of the Cayman accounts. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I looked at the name listed as the sole proprietor of the offshore shell company. It was Dominique. She was not just a spoiled daughter living off her father's wealth. She was actively bleeding his company dry to fund her fake billionaire lifestyle. She had embezzled nearly $12 million of corporate funds, completely obliterating Vanguard's liquidity and accelerating her own father's financial ruin. This was not just a civil matter of unpaid corporate debts anymore. Dominique was a corporate criminal looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary. I leaned back in my leather chair, a cold, ruthless smile spreading across my face. She wanted to ruin my life over a seating card. Now I held the key to her prison cell. I securely locked my workstation and instructed David to package the embezzlement evidence into an encrypted external drive. The federal authorities would need this pristine, but I was not handing it over just yet. Timing in finance and revenge is everything. I grabbed my trench coat and slipped out the private executive elevator. I had a coffee date with the only family member who still mattered to me. I walked 2 blocks through the crisp morning air to a discreet high-end espresso bar tucked away from the main financial district thoroughfares. Leo was already sitting in a corner booth. He looked exhausted. His shoulders were slumped and he was staring blankly into a black coffee. He was still wearing the gray t-shirt and jeans from this morning, but the furious, commanding energy he displayed at my apartment had drained out of him, leaving behind the raw, hollow look of a man who had just survived a massive collision. I slid into the leather booth across from him. I ordered a flat white from the passing barista and turned my full attention to my brother. "How are you holding up?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, dragging a hand down his face. "I kicked her out, Natalie. I threw her designer trash bags into the hallway and changed the locks. My phone has been vibrating out of control for 2 hours. Mom and Dad left me 14 voicemails calling me a disgrace, saying I ruined our family reputation. They actually drove to my building and tried to convince the concierge to let them into my unit so they could wait for me. I had to threaten to call the police to make them leave. They ambushed my apartment too," I said, stirring my coffee as it arrived. "They demanded I take out a personal loan to reimburse Richard for the wedding." Leo looked up, his eyes widening in disgust. "You have to be kidding me. After the way Dominique treated you at that reception, they want you to pay for her ruined party." I smiled thinly. "Do not worry about Mom and Dad." I gave them a very abrupt reality check regarding Richard's actual net worth. They are currently panicking in their leased car. But I did not call you here to talk about them. I need to know exactly how deep Dominique got her claws into your finances. We need to assess your exposure before Vanguard Logistics completely collapses." Leo rubbed his temples, looking deeply ashamed. "It is bad, Natalie. I feel like an absolute idiot. It started small." She claimed her father was restructuring his corporate accounts for tax purposes, and her allowance was temporarily frozen. She asked me to cover her car lease for a month. Then it was her country club fees. Then she needed a sudden cash injection for the wedding deposit because Richard's funds were tied up in a warehouse acquisition. "She drained your savings," I stated factually, piecing together the timeline. "Every dime," Leo admitted, his voice tight with anger and regret. I had $90,000 saved. I worked 70-hour weeks for 4 years to build that up. She wiped it out in 6 months. Whenever I pushed back, she would cry and say I was not acting like a supportive partner. She told me Richard would write me a massive check the day after the wedding to cover everything with interest. It was all a scam to maintain her elite image while her father was secretly going broke. I leaned across the table, my corporate instincts taking over. She is worse than broke, Leo. My team just completed a forensic audit of Vanguard Logistics. Dominique has been embezzling millions of dollars from her own father's company into a Cayman Islands shell account. She is a white-collar criminal. Leo stared at me, the color draining from his face. He sat back against the leather booth, processing the sheer magnitude of the bullet he had just dodged. Embezzlement. She was stealing from Richard. Yes, I said. And we are going to hand that evidence directly to the federal authorities. But first, I need to make sure your name is nowhere near her fraudulent accounts. Did you sign any joint banking agreements? No, Leo said quickly. I refused. That was actually the catalyst for our biggest fight. 2 months ago, I finally realized she was bleeding me dry. I packed my bags. I told her the wedding was off and I was leaving her. I frowned, confused. Then why did you go through with the rehearsal and the reception? Why were you standing at that altar yesterday? Leo looked away, his jaw clenching tight. Because she trapped me, Natalie. The morning I tried to leave, she walked out of the bathroom sobbing and holding a positive pregnancy test. The air in the coffee shop felt suddenly heavy. I stared at my brother, feeling a fresh wave of absolute fury toward the woman who had tried to destroy him. She told me she was pregnant, Leo whispered, his voice cracking with the memory of the manipulation. She begged me to stay. She said we were starting a family and that Richard would hand over a massive trust fund for the baby once we were legally married. She played on every instinct I had to be a responsible father. I stayed. I drained the rest of my accounts for the wedding because I thought I was protecting my unborn child. How did you find out it was a lie? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Last night, Leo said, his eyes hardening with cold, focused anger. After we walked out of the reception, I went back to the hotel suite to pack my things before she got there. I found her medical file sitting on the desk. She went to a private clinic last week for a routine procedure. The blood work was completely normal. There was no pregnancy. There never was. She bought a fake test online to force me to the altar because her father's money was drying up and she needed a backup financial host. I reached across the table and grabbed his hand, squeezing it firmly. You are safe now, Leo. I promise you. I have the best corporate lawyers in the city, already drafting a defensive perimeter around your assets. She cannot touch your engineering patents, she cannot claim common law marriage, and she cannot legally retaliate. You are fully protected from the fallout. Vanguard Logistics will be liquidated by the end of the week, and Dominique will be facing federal indictment. She is done. Leo let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension visibly leaving his body. He looked at me with immense gratitude. Thank you, Natalie. I should have listened to you from the beginning. You always saw right through her. I just know a bad investment when I see one, I replied smoothly. Leo nodded, a dark, vindictive spark suddenly lighting up his eyes. Speaking of bad investments, he said, pulling his smartphone from his pocket. While I was packing her things this morning, I synced her cloud storage to retrieve my own engineering documents. I found a folder of deleted voicemails she thought were permanently erased. I think you need to hear this one. It is a message she left for her best friend 3 weeks ago. He tapped the screen, pushed the volume to maximum, and slid the phone across the polished wood table. Dominique's arrogant, shrill voice drifted clearly through the speaker. Girl, I am exhausted, the recorded voice complained. Leo is being so annoying about the wedding budget. He keeps asking when my dad is going to wire the money. I literally had to fake crying yesterday just to get him to pay the florist. I do not even want to marry him, honestly. He is so boring and his family is completely middle class and pathetic, especially that miserable sister of his. But my dad's accounts are locked up right now, and I need someone to pay my credit card minimums until my offshore transfers clear. Leo is just a pathetic placeholder. The minute I get my hands on the Cayman money, I am serving him with the prenup and leaving him with nothing. I am just using him to bridge the gap before my real life begins. The voicemail clicked off. I reached over and gently tapped his phone screen, forwarding the audio file to my secure corporate server. That recording is the final nail in her coffin, I said quietly. It establishes premeditated financial exploitation. When my legal team presents this during the fraud investigation, she will not be able to claim ignorance or a simple misunderstanding. She planned to drain your accounts to cover her tracks before her offshore transfers cleared. Leo nodded slowly, his posture straightening. Do whatever you have to do, Natalie. Burn it all down. I stood up from the booth, tossing a $20 bill onto the table. Consider it done. Go home, lock your doors, and do not answer any calls from unknown numbers. I have a corporate execution to oversee. While I walked back to the towering glass skyscraper of Apex Holdings, Richard was experiencing the most humiliating morning of his professional life. He had spent the last 2 hours pacing his vast, silent office at Vanguard Logistics, watching his employees pack their belongings into cardboard boxes through the glass walls. Panic had completely overtaken the building. The trucking fleets were grounded. The warehouse leases were defaulting. Richard knew he was entirely out of options within the standard banking system. Apex Holdings had frozen his primary credit lines, but he still had one desperate long-shot play left. He needed a white knight investor, someone with enough aggressive capital to buy out his debt from Apex Holdings and issue an emergency bridge loan. He needed a rival predator. He picked up his phone and dialed William Thorne, the ruthless CEO of Thorne Capital Group. Thorne Capital was notorious for aggressive corporate bailouts, swooping in to save dying companies in exchange for massive equity stakes. Richard had always hated William, considering him a vulture, but today he was perfectly willing to beg. Miraculously, William agreed to a meeting. Richard sprinted out of his failing headquarters, hopped into his leased luxury sedan, and sped toward the financial district, completely ignoring the speed limits. He rehearsed his pitch the entire drive. He would blame the liquidity crisis on a temporary supply chain glitch. He would frame Apex Holdings as unreasonable and aggressive. High would offer Thorne Capital a 30% equity stake in Vanguard Logistics in exchange for an immediate $50 million cash injection. 20 minutes later, Richard was sitting sweating in a plush leather chair inside the sprawling, ultra-modern boardroom of Thorne Capital Group. William Thorne sat across from him, sipping sparkling water and looking entirely unbothered by Richard's frantic energy. William, I am coming to you because you understand the logistics sector, Richard pleaded, leaning across the massive oak table. Vanguard is fundamentally sound. We have a massive market share on the West Coast. This current crisis is nothing but a manufactured disaster. It is a hostile rogue maneuver by a mid-level director at Apex Holdings who is using her corporate authority to settle a petty personal vendetta. William raised an eyebrow, setting his glass down. A personal vendetta. That is a heavy accusation, Richard. Apex Holdings is not known for letting their directors run wild. They are the most disciplined private equity firm on Wall Street. She is a vindictive, emotional woman. Richard spat, his face turning red with indignation. Her name is Natalie. She is the sister of the man my daughter was supposed to marry this weekend. The wedding fell apart, and she is using Apex's financial leverage to throw a temper tantrum. It is highly illegal, and I am already drafting a massive lawsuit against her and the firm. But right now, I need immediate liquidity to bypass the freeze she placed on my primary accounts. I need $50 million by noon, William. I am willing to offer you a 30% equity stake in Vanguard Logistics. You buy out the debt. Apex is holding issue the bridge loan, and we crush her pathetic attempt at a corporate raid. Richard leaned back, panting, slightly convinced he had just delivered the pitch of his life. He was offering a massive piece of his empire. Any aggressive investment firm would jump at the chance to acquire that much equity for a fraction of its true value. He waited for William to slide a term sheet across the table. He waited for the lifeline that would save his mansion, his cars, and his elite social status. Instead, William Thorne started to laugh. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a deep, booming, unrestrained laugh that echoed off the boardroom walls. He laughed so hard he had to wipe a tear from the corner of his eye. Richard stiffened, gripping the armrests of his leather chair. What is so funny? I am offering you a golden opportunity. William finally caught his breath, shaking his head in absolute amusement. Richard, you truly are the most clueless man in the logistics industry. You come into my office sweating through your designer suit asking me for $50 million to fight a woman you just called a mid-level emotional director. You think she threw a temper tantrum. You think she is acting rogue. William picked up a thick black portfolio from his desk and tossed it directly at Richard. The heavy folder hit Richard in the chest and dropped onto his lap. "Open it!" William commanded, all traces of humor instantly vanishing from his voice. Richard opened the folder with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the first page and the remaining color completely drained from his face. It was a legal transfer of debt ownership. "Let me educate you on how real power works," Richard Williams said, leaning forward, his eyes locked onto the terrified CEO. "Natalie does not act rogue. She is the senior investment director at Apex Holdings, and she manages a war chest that makes my entire firm look like a piggy bank." At 7 o'clock this morning, Natalie contacted every single secondary creditor you owe money to. She contacted Bank of America, she contacted Chase, and she contacted me. Richard could not breathe. He stared at the signature on the document. It was William Thorne's signature transferring Vanguard's mezzanine debt directly to Apex Holdings. "You owed me $15 million!" Richard William continued, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Natalie offered to buy your toxic, worthless debt off my books for a 10% premium paid in cash immediately. I signed the paperwork 2 hours ago. Chase signed an hour ago. Bank of America signed 20 minutes ago. She did not just freeze your primary accounts. She orchestrated a mass debt buyout before you even got out of bed." Richard's hands shook so violently, the folder slipped from his grasp, spilling the legal documents across the pristine boardroom floor. "You cannot do this." Richard gasped, his chest heaving as a panic attack gripped him. "You cannot sell my debt without notifying my board." "You do not have a board anymore," Richard Williams sneered, standing up from his chair and adjusting his suit jacket. "You breached your fiduciary covenants the second you defaulted on your bridge loan this morning. That gave your creditors the legal right to sell your debt to the highest bidder. And Natalie bought it all. She owns 80% of your total corporate liabilities. She owns your commercial fleet. She owns your warehouse leases. She owns the mortgage on your mansion." William walked to the boardroom door and opened it, gesturing for Richard to leave. "You came here begging me for a bailout so you could fight her," William said, shaking his head in sheer disbelief at Richard's arrogance. "You cannot fight her, Richard. She is legally your boss now. And judging by the flawless, ruthless execution of this buyout, I highly recommend you start packing your boxes. You are completely finished." Richard stumbled out of the polished boardroom and into the busy financial district, the cold reality of his total corporate annihilation crushing the breath from his lungs. While he wandered the crowded city streets in a state of absolute shock, my personal cell phone buzzed on my desk at Apex Holdings. It was a voicemail from my mother. Catherine sounded frantic but laced her words with a sickeningly sweet tone I had not heard since my childhood. She begged me to meet her and my father for a private reconciliation dinner at the Capitol Prime Steakhouse. She claimed they had realized their terrible mistakes and wanted to apologize for the horrible things they said at my apartment that morning. I listened to the message twice. My parents did not do apologies. They did manipulation. I knew immediately this was a trap, a desperate maneuver orchestrated by people who were rapidly running out of options. I smiled, locked my workstation, and replied with a simple text confirming my attendance. At 8 o'clock that evening, I handed my keys to the valet outside the steakhouse. I was still wearing my tailored charcoal suit. The hostess greeted me warmly and escorted me past the crowded main dining floor into an exclusive soundproof private room at the back of the restaurant. Catherine and Thomas were already seated at the sprawling mahogany table. A bottle of vintage red wine was open, and my mother was nervously adjusting her linen napkin. When I walked in, they both stood up, forcing wide, unnatural smiles onto their faces. "Natalie, thank you so much for coming," Catherine gushed, gesturing to the empty leather chair across from them. "We know we were incredibly harsh this morning. We were just so overwhelmed by the wedding drama. Please sit down." I took my seat, placing my designer bag on the empty chair beside me. I did not touch the wine my father poured for me. I simply waited in silence. I knew the other shoe was about to drop. It took less than 5 minutes. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. Dominique walked in clutching a silk handkerchief to her chest, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Following closely behind her was Richard. He looked like a walking ghost. His shoulders were slumped, his expensive tie was loose, and the arrogant swagger he had displayed at the wedding reception was entirely gone. He avoided making eye contact with me, staring firmly at the carpet as he shuffled into the room. Catherine quickly stood up and locked the dining room doors from the inside. The trap was officially sprung. Dominique threw herself into the chair next to my mother, letting out a loud theatrical sob. She covered her face with her manicured hands, putting on an absolute masterclass in fake victimhood. "Natalie, please," Dominique wept, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I am so sorry about the seat card at the wedding. It was a terrible, thoughtless joke by my bridesmaids, and I should have stopped it." Leo misunderstood everything. He kicked me out of his apartment, and now my father is suffering because of a massive misunderstanding. Thomas leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He looked at me with the stern, authoritative glare he used when I was a teenager. "Natalie, we brought everyone here to settle this like adults. We know you were hurt, but what you did today crosses a massive legal line." I raised an eyebrow, picking up a leather-bound menu. "What exactly did I do, Dad?" "You used your clerk connections at Apex Holdings to freeze Richard's accounts," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a harsh reprimand. "Dominique explained everything to us. You found an IT loophole and filed a fraudulent risk management report to trigger a lockdown on Vanguard Logistics. You abused your low-level position to throw a temper tantrum. Now you are going to pick up your phone, call whatever manager you tricked, and tell them it was a massive accounting error. You will undo this mess immediately before Richard presses federal charges against you." I lowered my menu and looked at Dominique. She was staring at me with desperate, pleading eyes, hoping I would just go along with her pathetic lie. She could not accept the reality of my power, so she had spun a delusional fantasy for my parents, convincing them I was just a rogue secretary playing a petty prank. I shifted my gaze to Richard. He sat silently at the far end of the table, looking physically ill. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He knew the terrifying truth. William Thorne had handed him the legally binding transfer documents signed by me. Richard knew with absolute certainty that I owned 80% of his corporate debt. He knew I was the senior investment director orchestrating his ruin. But he was too deeply ashamed, too thoroughly broken to correct my ignorant parents. He had dragged himself to this ambush dinner hoping that raw parental pressure would somehow force me to show mercy before the bankruptcy courts opened. I listened to their relentless delusional lecturing. I did not interrupt. I did not correct them. I simply flagged down our dedicated waiter. "I will have the dry-aged bone-in ribeye medium rare, a side of truffle asparagus, the lobster mac and cheese, and half a dozen oysters. And please bring another bottle of your most expensive Cabernet." Catherine slammed her hand on the table. "Stop ordering food and fix this right now. We are your parents, and we are ordering you to reverse this glitch. Dominique's family is too important to be ruined by your petty jealousy." I spent the next hour eating my dinner in complete, unbothered silence. The steak was cooked to perfection. I savored every bite while Catherine shrieked about family loyalty. Thomas threatened to call the police on me, and Dominique continued to cry her fake tears. Richard did not say a single word. He just stared at his empty plate, watching his daughter dig their grave deeper with every lie she told. When I finally finished my meal, I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin and gestured for the waiter. The leather booklet arrived, promptly placed precisely in the center of the table. I opened it and glanced at the printed total: $2,000. Thomas patted his suit pockets with exaggerated authority, looking expectantly at Richard to cover the extravagant meal. The mighty logistics CEO did not move a single muscle. He stared blankly at the tablecloth. He knew every single platinum and black card in his leather wallet would instantly decline. Dominique suddenly found the ornate ceiling tiles fascinating, pretending she did not notice the heavy leather booklet sitting right in front of her. I smiled. I reached into my designer bag, pulled out a thick banded stack of crisp $100 bills, and methodically counted out 22 bills. I dropped the $2,200 in cash directly onto the mahogany table. The dull thud of the thick currency hitting the wood made Catherine actually choke on her own breath. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit. I ignored my parents entirely. I ignored Dominique's gaping mouth. I looked dead into Richard's defeated, terrified eyes. Meet me at the Apex Holdings boardroom at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to discuss your surrender. I walked out of the private dining room without looking back, leaving the heavy oak doors open behind me. The crisp night air outside the steakhouse was a welcome relief from the suffocating stench of their desperation. I handed my tickets to the valet, slipped into my car, and drove straight back to the towering glass monolith of Apex Holdings. The city was asleep, but my war room was wide awake. I stepped into my penthouse office, shedding my suit jacket and rolling up my sleeves. David was already sitting at the massive conference table, surrounded by stacks of forensic accounting files and half-empty coffee cups. "Are the bankruptcy covenants finalized?" I asked, pulling up the digital ledger on my main monitor. David slid a thick bound folder across the polished wood. "Ironclad. We mapped every single offshore wire transfer. Richard has been using Vanguard Logistics operating capital to pay fake consulting invoices generated by a Cayman Islands shell corporation. And the sole proprietor of that shell corporation is Dominique," what I stated, opening the folder to verify the registration signatures. "Exactly," David confirmed, pointing to a highlighted flowchart tracing the stolen capital. "She embezzled $12 million directly out of her own father's liquidity reserves. We linked her shell company directly to Richard's falsified tax returns. They are legally tethered together in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy." I reviewed the margin calculations with ruthless precision. If Richard attempts to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy tomorrow to protect his personal assets from our seizure, the federal court will mandate an immediate forensic asset trace. That trace will hit Dominique's Cayman account within 48 hours. The moment the feds see those fake invoices, Richard goes down for corporate fraud, and Dominique goes to a federal penitentiary for embezzlement and tax evasion. "They are completely boxed in," I said, a cold smile forming as I signed the final execution order. "If Richard surrenders the company to me tomorrow morning, I acquire Vanguard Logistics and absorb his commercial fleet. If he fights me, I hand this folder to the Department of Justice, and his daughter spends the next 10 years wearing an orange jumpsuit. The margin of their ruin is absolute. Print 3 copies of this binder. I want them sitting on the boardroom table at 9 o'clock sharp." While I was meticulously arming the financial guillotine, Dominique was experiencing a complete psychological meltdown across town. The reality of her total poverty had finally shattered her delusions. Her credit cards were plastic garbage. Her father was facing complete annihilation. She had absolutely no access to the luxury lifestyle she felt utterly entitled to. Desperation makes arrogant people incredibly dangerous. She needed a financial host, and she needed one immediately. At 2 in the morning, Leo was sitting on his couch finalizing the legal lockdown on his engineering patents. The sudden violent pounding on his front door made him jump. "Leo, open this door. I know you are awake." It was Dominique. Her voice was shrill, frantic, and laced with a terrifying edge of hysteria. Leo walked to the door, checking the security peephole. She was standing in the hallway, looking disheveled and unhinged. Her designer coat was thrown hastily over pajamas, and her eyes were wide with manic panic. "Go away," Dominique, Leo stated firmly through the solid wood door. "You are trespassing. I am calling building security. If you do not open this door right now, I will start screaming that you are hurting me." Dominique threatened, her voice dropping into a vicious, calculated whisper. "I will wake up this entire floor and tell them you dragged me out here." Leo clenched his jaw. He unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, blocking the threshold with his body. "What do you want?" Dominique pushed hard against his chest, forcing her way into the apartment. She paced the living room like a caged animal, breathing heavily. You are going to marry me, she demanded, turning to face him with wild eyes. We are going to the courthouse the second it opens tomorrow morning. We are getting married, and you are going to add my name to your primary checking accounts and your patent portfolio. Leo stared at her, utterly baffled by her sheer audacity. Are you having a psychotic break? I kicked you out yesterday. I know about your $80,000 in secret debt. I know about your fake pregnancy test. I heard the voicemail where you called me a pathetic placeholder. I would rather light myself on fire than marry you. Dominique's face contorted into an ugly, hateful snarl. She grabbed the collar of her own designer blouse and violently yanked it downward, ripping the delicate silk fabric. She reached up and purposefully scratched her own cheek, dragging her manicured fingernails hard enough to leave bright red welts. Leo took a cautious step back. What are you doing? I am taking my life back, Dominique hissed, her eyes gleaming with malicious intent. You think your sister has all the power because she plays with spreadsheets. I have power too, Leo. I am a beautiful woman standing in your apartment at 2 in the morning with torn clothes and scratches on my face. She picked up a heavy glass vase from the side table and smashed it aggressively against the hardwood floor. The shattering glass echoed loudly in the quiet apartment. If you do not agree to marry me tomorrow and give me full access to your finances, I am calling the police right now. Dominique threatened, stepping closer to him, her voice dripping with pure malice. I am going to tell them you begged me to come over to talk, and when I rejected you, you flew into a violent rage. I will say you hit me. I will say you tore my clothes and threw that vase at my head. You will be arrested for domestic battery. Your engineering firm will fire you before lunchtime to avoid the public relations nightmare. Your entire career will be destroyed instantly. Leo did not panic. He did not beg. He did not even raise his voice. He just looked at the desperate, manipulative woman standing in his living room, surrounded by broken glass and her own shattered lies. He slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out his smartphone and tapped the screen. A live video feed popped up. You really should have noticed the upgrades I made today, Leo said, his voice deadly calm. He pointed a steady finger toward the corner of the ceiling just above the kitchen cabinets. Then he pointed to a small, sleek black device resting discreetly on the bookshelf. Dominique froze her eyes, darting to the devices. After I threw you out yesterday, I realized you were unstable enough to try something exactly like this. Leo explained smoothly, showing her the live feed on his phone. I had high-definition security cameras installed. They capture 4K video and crystal-clear audio. They are synced directly to a secure cloud server that you cannot access or destroy. Dominique stopped breathing. The color completely vanished from her scratched face. The cameras caught you ripping your own shirt. Leo continued, his voice echoing with absolute finality in the quiet room. They caught you scratching your own face. They caught you smashing my vase. And they caught every single word of your extortion attempt. If you do not walk out of that door in the next 10 seconds, I am calling the police myself and handing them the footage. Dominique stared at the black camera lens, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The malicious confidence completely drained from her eyes, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. She had finally hit a wall she could not manipulate, scream, or cry her way through. She turned on her heel and sprinted out of the apartment, leaving the door wide open. Leo locked the deadbolt, blocked her number, and finally went to sleep. At 8:45 the next morning, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb outside the towering glass and steel monolith of Apex Holdings. The building scraped the sky, a vertical fortress of wealth that cast a long, imposing shadow over the financial district. Richard stepped out of the car first. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. His designer suit hung loosely on his shoulders. His face was pale and his hands trembled slightly as he smoothed his tie. Catherine and Thomas climbed out next, craning their necks to stare up at the dizzying height of the skyscraper. Thomas adjusted his coat, trying to project authority, but his wide eyes betrayed his deep intimidation. Dominique exited the vehicle last. She had spent hours applying heavy makeup to cover the scratches she inflicted on her own face the night before. Despite her disastrous, humiliating encounter with Leo, her delusion remained her strongest defense mechanism. She sneered at the polished brass revolving doors gripping her faux designer handbag tight. "This building is entirely too nice for a low-level clerk." Dominique scoffed her heels, clicking aggressively against the pristine pavement. "She probably sorts mail in a windowless sub-basement." When I tell her boss that she used company software to play a prank on my father, security is going to throw her out on the street. She will be begging us for a grocery allowance by lunchtime. Catherine nodded vigorously, latching onto the toxic narrative. Exactly, Dominique. Natalie has completely lost her mind. She embarrassed us in front of the elite, and now she is playing ridiculous computer games. We are going to march down to her little cubicle, force her to reverse this absurd glitch on Richard's accounts and demand a written apology. If she refuses, Thomas and I are officially disowning her today. Thomas puffed out his chest, stepping beside Richard. "Do not worry, Richard. We will handle my daughter. She has always been bitterly jealous of anyone with actual money. We will put an end to this cyber stunt immediately." Richard did not respond. He stared blankly at the massive Apex Holdings logo etched into the marble wall above the entrance. His stomach churned with violent nausea. He knew this was not a glitch. He knew Natalie was not a clerk. He had seen the legally binding transfer documents signed by William Thorne. He knew the woman waiting inside owned 80% of his corporate liabilities, but he was entirely too paralyzed by shame and terror to warn his future in-laws. He just kept walking, marching mindlessly toward the financial slaughterhouse. They stepped through the revolving doors into a sprawling, immaculate lobby that hummed with intense corporate energy. Men and women in tailored suits moved purposefully across the gleaming floors. The air smelled of expensive espresso and crisp currency. Dominique marched straight up to the towering security desk, completely ignoring the velvet ropes meant to organize visitors. She slammed her hand flat against the polished stone counter, demanding the immediate attention of the head security director. "I am looking for a clerk named Natalie." "Dominique," barked her voice, loud and grating against the hushed professional atmosphere of the lobby. "She is a low-level employee who committed corporate fraud against Vanguard Logistics. Call her manager down here immediately. We are not leaving until she reverses the freeze on my father's assets. Point me to the freight elevator so we can go down to her basement desk." A polished receptionist in a tailored suit stepped forward from behind the desk, holding a digital tablet. She calmly pulled up her directory and tapped the screen. "May I have your name, ma'am?" Dominique let out a harsh, arrogant sigh. "I am Dominique. This is Richard, the CEO of Vanguard Logistics. We are here to see Natalie." The receptionist's eyes flicked to the screen, and her entire demeanor shifted instantly. The neutral, polite customer service expression vanished, replaced by an attitude of rigid, utmost respect. She picked up a dedicated red phone resting on the desk, pressed a single button, and spoke in a hushed, urgent tone. "The VIP party has arrived. Initiate the Alpha Protocol." Catherine leaned toward Thomas, whispering with a triumphant smirk. "You see, Thomas, Alpha Protocol. They are calling security to have Natalie disciplined. They know she committed a cybercrime. This firm is going to fire her on the spot." The receptionist placed the phone down and stepped out from behind the massive marble desk. She gestured politely toward a private corridor guarded by 2 additional armed officers. "Right this way, please," the receptionist said smoothly. "We have been expecting you." Dominique smirked at her father, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "See, Dad. I told you. They are taking us to the disciplinary office. She is finished." They followed the receptionist past the bustling rows of lower-level workstations on the ground floor, bypassing the standard employee elevators entirely. They turned a corner and arrived in a secluded, quiet alcove featuring a single sleek glass-walled elevator. There were no buttons on the wall. The receptionist pulled a heavy, encrypted black keycard from her breast pocket and scanned it against a hidden biometric reader. The glass doors slid open silently. Catherine frowned, looking around the highly restricted area. "Why are we using a private elevator to go to the basement?" "You are not going to the basement, ma'am," the receptionist replied, stepping inside the plush mirrored car and gesturing for them to follow. The doors closed and the elevator did not go down. It shot violently upwards. The sheer speed pushed them back against the mirrored walls. The digital floor indicator climbed past the 20th floor, the 40th floor, the 60th floor. Dominique's smug expression began to crack, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. Catherine clutched Thomas's arm as they bypassed the entire corporate structure of the building. The elevator finally slowed, coming to a smooth, silent halt at the absolute pinnacle of the skyscraper. The digital screen flashed a bright gold number, floor 85. The glass doors slid open, revealing an atmosphere that commanded pure, terrifying authority. The receptionist escorts them past the cubicles straight into the exclusive keycard access-only executive penthouse suite. The receptionist escorted them past the initial security threshold, leading the silent group straight into the exclusive keycard access-only executive penthouse suite. The vast space was a monument to corporate power. Glossy obsidian floors reflected the morning sunlight streaming through massive windows. There were no cubicles here, only towering glass walls, original artwork, and the hushed silence of serious money changing hands. The receptionist guided them into a sprawling boardroom featuring a massive polished oak table and 30 leather chairs. She gestured for them to take a seat, offered a tight professional smile, and exited, closing the heavy double doors behind her with a soft click. The moment they were alone, the tension in the room skyrocketed. Richard sank into a leather chair at the far end of the table. His hands were trembling so badly he had to interlock his fingers to hide the shaking. He was sweating profusely, his expensive cologne turning sour under the sheer terror gripping his chest. He knew exactly what this room represented. This was the execution chamber. Catherine looked around, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She touched the smooth leather of the chair next to Thomas. "Thomas, why are we in the billionaire wing?" Catherine whispered, her voice laced with sudden anxiety. "This does not make any sense. Why would a low-level clerk have access to a boardroom like this? They must have brought us here to speak with her superiors to formally fire her." Dominique paced the length of the room, her heels clicking aggressively against the floor. She refused to sit down. Her delusion was fighting a desperate battle against the overwhelming display of wealth surrounding her. "Do not be ridiculous," Dominique scoffed, crossing her arms and glaring at the closed doors. "They just put us in here because my father is the CEO of Vanguard Logistics. They know we are elite clients. Natalie is probably in the basement break room right now, getting yelled at by human resources. They are going to make her bring us coffee on a silver tray and force her to apologize while she pours it. She is nothing but a glorified secretary." Richard let out a strangled, pathetic groan, burying his face in his hands. "Dominique, shut your—" Richard croaked, his voice cracking with absolute despair. "You have no idea what you have done." Dominique snapped her head toward her father, completely outraged by his tone. "What are you talking about? I am the victim here." Before Richard could explain the catastrophic reality of their situation, the heavy oak doors at the front of the boardroom swung open. Dominique smirked, standing tall, fully expecting to see Natalie wheeling in a coffee cart in tears. Instead, a team of 6 high-powered corporate litigators filed into the room. They carried thick legal binders and wore suits that cost more than Thomas made in a year. They moved with military precision, taking their seats along the left side of the table without saying a single word. Then the final person walked through the doors. It was Leo. He looked completely transformed. He wore a sharp-tailored navy suit, projecting a calm, icy confidence. He walked directly to the right side of the table, pulled out a leather chair, and sat down. He looked straight at Dominique, his face completely devoid of the love he once held for her. Instead, a slow, triumphant smirk spread across his face. Dominique's jaw dropped. She stared at the man she had just tried to blackmail, her brain completely short-circuiting. Leo was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be cowering in his apartment, waiting for her father to destroy his engineering career. Instead, he sat alongside the most intimidating legal team she had ever seen, looking utterly relaxed. Catherine bolted upright in her chair, her panic overriding her confusion. "Leo, what on earth are you doing here?" she shrieked, her voice cracking in the cavernous room. "Get over here right now before you get us all sued. You have no idea who these people are." Leo did not move an inch. He simply leaned back, folded his hands, and kept that cold, piercing gaze fixed directly on Dominique. Thomas slammed his fist onto the table, trying to project the authority he had entirely lost. "Who is running this meeting?" he demanded, looking at the silent row of corporate lawyers. "My son is clearly confused, and we are here to speak with the senior director about an urgent reversal of assets." The lawyers did not blink. They did not answer. They simply turned their heads in unison toward the head of the table. A massive, high-backed leather executive chair faced the floor-to-ceiling windows, obscuring the person sitting in it. Slowly, deliberately, the chair began to swivel around. The mechanical hum of the rotating chair was the only sound in the dead silence of the penthouse boardroom. As the chair locked into position facing the table, the air in the room seemed to freeze. I sat there, resting my elbows on the polished oak. I was wearing my custom-tailored charcoal suit, projecting a level of absolute terrifying authority I usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. I looked at the four trembling people across from me, letting the sheer weight of my presence crush the remaining breath from their lungs. Catherine let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her hands flew to her throat, her eyes bulging out of her skull, as if she were looking at an apparition. Thomas collapsed back into his seat mouth, opening and closing without producing a sound. The reality of my wealth, the staggering truth of my position, violently dismantled their entire worldview in a matter of seconds. Dominique turned a sickly, translucent shade of pale. The arrogant bride who had spent the last day screaming insults at me realized she was trapped in a cage with an apex predator. She looked from me to the lawyers, the horrifying puzzle pieces finally snapping together. Richard did not gasp. He just stared at the table, his spirit entirely broken. I reached beside me and picked up a thick legal binder. I slid it firmly down the mahogany table. It stopped right in front of Richard and Dominique. "You called me a broke-ass sister living off her brother. As of 8:00 a.m. this morning, I own your company, your house, and your daughter's debt. Let's talk." The deafening silence in the executive boardroom stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. No one dared to breathe. The air conditioning hummed faintly overhead, a stark contrast to the financial execution about to take place on the polished mahogany table. Richard stared at the thick legal binder sitting inches from his trembling hands. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the sheer terrifying magnitude of his defeat. He reached out with shaking fingers, slowly flipping open the heavy cover. The first page was a master deed of assignment. My signature sat right next to the signatures of the CEOs from Chase Bank of America and Thorne Capital Group. "This cannot be real," Catherine whispered, her voice barely a squeak as she clutched Thomas's arm. "Natalie, stop this immediately. You are going to go to jail for forging these papers. Richard, tell her she is going to jail." Richard did not speak. His eyes darted rapidly across the heavily notarized documents, reading the exact figures of his catastrophic corporate debt. He saw the $80 million in commercial liabilities that I had purchased for pennies on the dollar. He saw the immediate default clauses. He saw his entire life laid bare in crisp black ink. "Shut up," Catherine. Richard finally wheezed, his voice cracking under the weight of his absolute ruin. He did not look up from the binder. He kept his eyes glued to the numbers, his face slick with cold sweat. "She is not forging anything. These are real. She owns all of it." Thomas slumped so far down in his expensive leather chair he looked as if his spine had dissolved. His mind, previously filled with arrogant country club fantasies, was violently short-circuiting. I leaned back in my executive chair, steepling my fingers. "I promised you a discussion regarding your surrender, Richard. But first, let us review why Vanguard Logistics is currently bleeding out on my operating table. You ran a masterclass in aggressive incompetence. You inflated your commercial fleet valuation by logging trucks that were sold for scrap 5 years ago. You mortgaged your own corporate headquarters twice to cover empty warehouse leases. You thought you could hide your insolvency by churning high-yield debt, but you tripped the federal liquidity covenants at 6 o'clock this morning. You set me up!" Richard gasped, finally looking up at me with bloodshot eyes. "You deliberately orchestrated the margin call to trigger the default. I merely accelerated the inevitable," I replied, my voice devoid of any mercy. "You were a dead man walking. I just handed you the shovel to dig your own grave. But I cannot take full credit for the collapse of your logistics empire." In fact, the fatal blow did not come from Apex Holdings at all. The fatal blow came from inside your own house. Dominique, who had been sitting frozen in a state of hyperventilating shock, suddenly snapped her head toward me. Her eyes widened with frantic defensive panic. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the massive room. "Dad, do not listen to her. She is just a bitter, jealous loser trying to turn you against me because Leo dumped me." I ignored her screeching entirely. I flipped open my own copy of the binder and pulled out a stack of financial logs highlighted in bright neon yellow. I slid the papers smoothly across the long table. They came to a halt right on top of Richard's open binder. "While my team was conducting the forensic audit of your remaining assets this morning," I continued, keeping my gaze locked on Richard, "we found a massive gaping hole in your operating capital. $12 million to be exact. $12 million transferred out of Vanguard Logistics over the past 24 months in highly suspicious steady increments." Richard frowned, his panic temporarily shifting into utter confusion. He picked up the highlighted papers. "I authorized those payments. They were legitimate consulting invoices for international supply chain optimization. The Cayman Islands firm was highly vetted." I smiled thinly. "Vetted by whom, Richard?" Richard swallowed hard. "By my executive management team. By Dominique. She handles international vendor relations." Dominique leaped out of her chair, her face contorting into an ugly mask of sheer terror. "Stop talking to her, Dad. She hacked into our private servers. We need to call the police right now and have her arrested for corporate espionage." "Sit down," Leo barked from the right side of the table, his voice cracking like a whip. The sudden explosive command from my brother made Dominique flinch, and she dropped back into her leather seat, her chest heaving. I looked at Richard, letting the silence draw out just long enough to torture him. "I want you to read the name of the sole proprietor listed on the Cayman Islands Shell Corporation registry. It is on page 4, paragraph 2. Richard flipped the pages with frantic, trembling fingers. His eyes scanned the dense legal text. He stopped. He read the line again. He read it a third time, bringing the paper closer to his face, as if the letters might magically rearrange themselves. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening chalky gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Your daughter is not just a spoiled socialite," I stated, my voice ringing with cold, brutal clarity. "She is a white-collar criminal. She created a fake international consulting firm, generated fraudulent invoices, and used her executive clearance to authorize payments directly from your liquidity reserves into her own offshore bank account. She embezzled $12 million from you, Richard. She bled your company dry to fund her designer bags, her luxury vacations, and her ridiculous wedding aesthetic. She is the reason you could not satisfy the margin call this morning." "That is a lie!" Dominique screamed, jumping up again and slamming her hands on the table. "She is planting fake evidence." Richard slowly lowered the papers. He turned his head and looked at his daughter. He looked at the custom designer suit she was wearing. He thought about the $80,000 in secret credit card debt Leo had been forced to pay off. He thought about the sudden, inexplicable cash flow crises that had plagued his company for 2 years, always coinciding with Dominique's lavish spending sprees. "You stole from me," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with a horrifying mix of betrayal and absolute rage. "You stole $12 million from your own father." "Dad, no." Dominique pleaded, stepping back from the table, her arrogant facade completely shattering into pathetic desperation. "I was going to pay it back. I just needed the money temporarily to maintain our image. You said our image was the most important thing. I was protecting our elite status." "You destroyed my life!" Richard roared. The sound was deafening. Richard lunged forward, his chair flying backward and crashing to the floor. Before anyone could react, he closed the distance between them. He raised his hand and violently slapped Dominique across the face. The sharp, brutal crack echoed off the glass walls of the penthouse boardroom. Catherine shrieked in horror, covering her eyes. Thomas scrambled backward in his chair, trying to meld with the wall. The force of the blow sent Dominique sprawling. She hit the polished obsidian floor hard, her designer handbag spilling its contents across the room. She lay there for a second, completely stunned, a bright red handprint blossoming rapidly across her cheek. Her own father looked down at her with a level of hatred so pure it practically burned the oxygen out of the air. Dominique scrambled onto her hands and knees. Her perfect hair was a mess, her expensive clothes wrinkled and her delusion entirely broken. She looked wildly around the room for anyone who could save her from the nightmare she had created. Her eyes locked onto Leo. She crawled across the cold floor, sobbing hysterically, until she reached his chair. She grabbed the fabric of his tailored trousers with trembling hands, looking up at him with mascara streaming down her face. "Leo, please," Dominique begged, her voice a pathetic broken whimper. "Please protect me. You love me. Tell them we are getting married. Tell them you will cover the money. Please do not let them send me to prison. You have to save me." Leo looked down at the woman who had spent the last year treating his family like garbage. He looked at the woman who had tried to extort him with fake abuse allegations just hours ago. He felt absolutely nothing but disgust. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. He looked dead into Dominique's terrified, pleading eyes and dropped the drive onto the floor right next to her trembling hands. "I brought the security footage you requested," Leo said coldly. "Good luck with the federal indictment." Dominique remained frozen on the floor, staring at the small silver flash drive as if it were a venomous snake. The arrogant bride who had spent the last year terrorizing my family, belittling my brother and draining his bank accounts was finally silenced. There was no more screaming, no more threats of powerful connections, and no more fake designer bags to hide behind. She was completely broken, staring into the abyss of her own creation. Richard, still standing over her, turned away in utter disgust. He did not offer his hand to help his daughter up. He simply walked to the far corner of the boardroom, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline, waiting for the inevitable end of his empire. But my attention was no longer on the bankrupt logistics CEO or his embezzling daughter. I turned my gaze back to the other side of the mahogany table where my parents were sitting in a state of catatonic shock. Catherine and Thomas had watched the entire financial execution unfold in absolute silence. Their minds, previously programmed to worship the illusion of elite society, were violently short-circuiting. For my entire life, they had measured human worth purely by luxury car brands, country club memberships, and flashy zip codes. They had discarded me, verbally abused me, and threatened to legally disown me just hours ago because I drove a 5-year-old sedan and refused to fund their pathetic social climbing fantasies. Now sitting in the penthouse suite of Apex Holdings, surrounded by corporate lawyers and hard evidence, the horrifying reality finally crushed them. They had spent their lives bowing down to a broke, fraudulent family while actively alienating a daughter who possessed enough wealth and power to buy and sell everyone in the room. Catherine was the first to break the silence. She slowly pushed herself up from her leather chair. Her hands were shaking violently. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the boardroom stripped away her polished, arrogant facade, revealing a terrified, aging woman who had just realized she backed the wrong horse. She stumbled toward the head of the table, her eyes welling up with sudden, desperate tears. "Natalie," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling with a sickeningly sweet tone that made my stomach churn. "Natalie, my beautiful girl, I cannot believe what these monsters tried to do to you." I sat back in my executive chair, steepling my fingers. I watched her perform with a detached, clinical interest. Catherine reached the edge of my desk, clasping her hands together in a prayer motion. "We had no idea, Natalie. We swear to you we had absolutely no idea Richard was a criminal. If your father and I had known they were running a scam, we never would have pushed Leo to marry her. We never would have demanded you pay for that wedding. They manipulated us just like they tried to manipulate your brother." Thomas quickly scrambled out of his seat and rushed to stand beside my mother. He nodded frantically, his face shiny with cold sweat. "Your mother is right, Natalie. We are the victims here too. Richard lied to my face. He tried to extort $5 million from me this morning. They are ruthless predators. But you stopped them. You saved our family from financial ruin. I have never been more proud of you than I am right in this very moment." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their pivot was almost impressive. Less than 3 hours ago, they had broken into my apartment, screamed in my face, and ordered me to get on my knees and apologize to Dominique. Now they were trying to rewrite history in real time, casting themselves as innocent bystanders, and praising the very same career they had spent a decade calling a low-level clerk job. I looked at Leo, who was sitting across the table watching our parents with absolute disgust. He shook his head slowly, refusing to engage with their pathetic display. "You are proud of me, Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "That is a fascinating shift in perspective. Just yesterday you told me I carried a poverty aura. You told me I was a bitter spinster who embarrassed the family. Mom told me I was a jealous, vindictive little girl who wanted to drag everyone down to my miserable tax bracket." Catherine let out a loud, theatrical sob, reaching across the table to try and grab my hand. I pulled my hand back immediately, letting her fingers grasp empty air. "We were wrong!" Catherine cried, the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. "We were so incredibly wrong, and we are so sorry. We were just blinded by the wedding stress. You know how much we love you, Natalie. You are our brilliant, successful daughter. We always knew you were destined for greatness. That is why we pushed you so hard. We just wanted you to achieve your full potential, and look at you now. You own this entire building. You are a titan." Thomas leaned forward, trying to project a fatherly warmth that he had never once genuinely possessed. "We want to make this right, Natalie. We want to celebrate your success properly. We can host a massive dinner at the club. We will invite everyone. We will show the whole city what our daughter has accomplished. Let us be a real family again. You, me, your mother, and Leo. We do not need these frauds." I stared at them, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the massive boardroom. I looked at their desperate, tear-stained faces. They were not crying because they regretted abusing me. They were not apologizing because they realized they had been terrible parents. They were crying because they wanted access to my war chest. They wanted to use my corporate title and my billions to secure the elite social status they had just lost when Richard's empire collapsed. They wanted to trade one financial host for another. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored charcoal suit. "You do not get to claim me now," I said, my voice echoing with brutal, absolute finality. "You do not get to spend 32 years treating me like an embarrassing inconvenience only to suddenly play the role of proud parents the second you see my bank account. You worshipped Dominique because she wore a fake designer dress. You worshipped Richard because he leased a luxury car. You chose the illusion of wealth over the reality of your own children's well-being." Catherine let out a sharp gasp, taking a step back as if I had physically struck her. "Natalie, please do not say that. We are your parents. You owe us respect." "I owe you absolutely nothing," I countered, staring her dead in the eye. "When Leo was struggling to pay his rent in college, you told him to figure it out himself. When I built my career from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks, you told your friends I was a glorified bank teller. You actively rooted for my failure because my independence threatened your need for control. You chose your side." I reached into the leather briefcase resting by my feet. I pulled out a crisp white legal folder bearing the official seal of Apex Holdings Corporate Counsel. I tossed it firmly onto the center of the mahogany table. It slid to a halt right in front of Thomas. "What is this?" Thomas stammered, looking down at the folder with creeping dread. "That is a legal severance of financial responsibility," I stated coldly. "It is a binding injunction drafted by my personal legal team. It permanently severs any and all financial ties between us. You are legally barred from claiming any connection to my estate, my corporate assets, or my private equity firm. You cannot use my name to secure loans. You cannot list me as a guarantor. You are completely, permanently cut off from my wealth." Catherine stared at the document, her mouth opening in a silent scream of absolute horror. The realization that she had just lost access to a multi-million-dollar empire shattered her completely. "You cannot do this to us!" Catherine shrieked, her voice pitching into pure hysteria. "We are your family." I looked at my mother, feeling nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. "You chose your family at the wedding. Now live with them." Catherine let out a wailing cry, collapsing onto the carpeted floor of the boardroom. She clawed at the hem of my charcoal suit, but I stepped back smoothly, leaving her grasping at thin air. Thomas stood paralyzed, his chest heaving, as he stared at the legal severance document that officially ended his ride on the gravy train. They had bet their entire existence on a mirage of elite status, and now they were left with absolutely nothing. While my parents drowned in their newfound reality of permanent middle-class mediocrity, a different kind of desperation was unfolding at the far end of the long mahogany table. Richard had stopped staring out the window. He was a survivor of dirty corporate warfare, a man who had built a career on exploiting loopholes and burning partners. His shock had finally worn off, replaced by the frantic calculating survival instinct of a cornered rat. He lunged back toward the conference table, entirely ignoring his sobbing daughter and my weeping parents. He ripped open his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of hastily stapled papers. "You think you have me backed into a corner? Natalie." Richard growled, his voice trembling with a manic, desperate energy. "You think a margin call and a debt buyout gives you the right to execute my life? You forgot one vital piece of the puzzle. I am the sole managing partner of Vanguard Logistics. The corporate veil protects my personal assets from predatory equity firms like yours." He slapped the papers down onto the polished wood. "This is a Chapter 11 bankruptcy petition," Richard declared wildly, waving a gold fountain pen in the air. "I had my corporate counsel draft it the moment my banking representative told me about the frozen accounts this morning. If I sign this and file it electronically before the markets close, Vanguard enters immediate federal restructuring. An automatic stay goes into effect. Your asset seizure gets tied up in federal bankruptcy court for the next 5 years. You cannot touch my mansion. You cannot touch my personal accounts. And you cannot touch my private trust. You win the company, but you get a hollow shell. I walk away protected." I remained standing at the head of the table, my expression utterly impassive. I crossed my arms and tilted my head, watching him uncap his expensive fountain pen. Dominique, who had been sitting paralyzed on the floor clutching the flash drive, Leo gave her, suddenly scrambled to her feet. The red handprint on her cheek stood out starkly against her pale skin. She stared at the bankruptcy papers her father was about to sign. "Wait!" Dominique gasped, her voice shrill with sudden realization. "If you file for Chapter 11 protection, the federal courts mandate a complete forensic audit of all operating capital. They are going to trace the missing $12 million. Richard did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the signature line. "That is your problem, Dominique. You generated the fake invoices. You set up the Cayman Islands Shell Corporation. You stole the money to buy your designer bags and fund your pathetic socialite lifestyle. I am filing this petition to shield my own estate. When the federal auditors find the hole in the ledger, they will trace the IP addresses right back to your executive account. You dug this grave. You can lie in it." Dominique let out a blood-curdling scream. "You cannot do this to me. You are my father. You are supposed to protect me. I only stole that money because you were going broke. I did it to save our image. If you sign that paper, I will go to federal prison. I am not going down for your corporate treason." Richard roared back, slamming his hand against the table. "I am saving what is left of my life. You are on your own." He lowered the gold pen to the signature line, pressing the nib against the thick white paper. "Go ahead and sign it, Richard," I said, my voice echoing coldly across the boardroom. "But you are about 4 hours too late to use the federal courts as your personal shield." Richard froze the tip of his pen, bleeding black ink into the paper. He looked up at me, his eyes widening in confusion and terror. "What are you talking about?" I checked the vintage luxury watch on my wrist. It was exactly 9:15 in the morning. "I never needed your bankruptcy filing to trigger a federal audit," I explained smoothly, walking slowly down the length of the table toward him. "My team finished our forensic sweep of your ledgers at 7 o'clock this morning. We did not just find Dominique's $12 million embezzlement ring. We also found the fraudulent loan applications you filed with Chase and Bank of America. We found the doctored tax returns you submitted to the IRS to inflate your fleet valuation. We found every single dirty illegal maneuver you pulled to keep Vanguard Logistics afloat." Richard dropped the pen. It clattered against the mahogany surface. His breathing became shallow and rapid. "I did not just draft an asset seizure notice today, Richard," I continued, stopping mere inches from where he stood. "I also drafted a comprehensive whistleblower report. I packaged all of your doctored tax returns, your fraudulent bank applications, and Dominique's offshore wire transfers onto a highly encrypted external drive. And then I handed it directly to the United States Department of Justice. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse boardroom suddenly swung open with a violent, authoritative crash. Everyone in the room jumped. Catherine let out another shriek, scrambling backward against the wall. Thomas threw his hands up defensively. Leo stood up from his chair, a grim smile of satisfaction settling onto his features. A team of 8 men and women wearing dark windbreakers walked into the boardroom. The bold yellow letters FBI were printed clearly across their backs. They moved with swift tactical precision, fanning out across the room and completely blocking the only exit. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern face, stepped forward. He held up a federal badge and a thick stack of warrants. Richard and Dominique, the agent, announced, his voice booming with absolute terrifying authority. "We are with the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, tax evasion, and bank fraud." No, Dominique shrieked, backing away until she hit the glass wall of the boardroom. "No, you do not understand. My father is a billionaire. My father is the CEO. I did not do anything wrong. It was a misunderstanding. She tricked us. She planted that evidence." 2 federal agents closed in on her instantly. They grabbed her wrists, spinning her around and forcing her face against the cold glass window. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the room. "Get your hands off me," Dominique sobbed hysterically, thrashing wildly against the officers. "Dad, do something. Call our lawyers. Tell them I am innocent." Richard could not help her. 2 other agents had already grabbed his arms aggressively, yanking them behind his back. The gold fountain pen he had tried to use to save himself rolled off the table and shattered on the floor. "This is your fault!" Richard screamed at his daughter, his face turning an apocalyptic shade of purple as the steel cuffs locked around his wrists. "You greedy, parasitic brat. You bled my company dry. You ruined my life. I will testify against you. I will tell the feds everything you did." "I hate you!" Dominique screamed back, her voice tearing through her throat as the agents began dragging her toward the boardroom doors. "You are a broke, pathetic fraud. You used me to maintain your fake empire. I hope you rot in prison. You are going to prison for a decade." Richard roared, kicking and struggling as the agents forcefully marched him out. "You destroyed our family!" Their vicious, hateful screams echoed down the pristine hallway of the penthouse suite, growing fainter and fainter until the heavy oak doors finally swung shut behind them. The sudden silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of total devastation. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, smoothing the lapels of my tailored suit, letting the reality of the moment settle over the room. At the opposite end of the table, my parents were a portrait of complete psychological collapse. Catherine was still on her knees on the polished obsidian floor. Her expensive mascara ran in dark, jagged streams down her cheeks, dripping onto the collar of her designer coat. She looked nothing like the arrogant, judgmental woman who had barged into my apartment just hours ago, demanding I take out a bank loan. Thomas was slumped in his leather executive chair, his breathing shallow and rapid. He stared blankly at the legal severance of financial responsibility resting on the wood in front of him. "You have 2 options," I said, my voice cutting through the dead air with surgical precision. "You can sign that document right now, legally, acknowledging that you have no claim to my estate, my corporate assets, or my private equity firm. Or you can refuse to sign it, and my legal team will spend the next 10 years burying you in litigation costs until you are forced to sell your house just to afford a defense attorney. Either way, you are walking out of this building with absolutely nothing." Catherine let out a pathetic, broken whimper. She scrambled up from the floor, clutching the edge of the table for support. "Natalie, please," she begged, her voice hoarse and broken. "You are our daughter. We gave you life. We raised you. You cannot just leave us like this. Richard is gone. Dominique is going to federal prison. Our entire social circle is going to find out we were associating with criminals. We will be ruined. We have no one else left." "You had me," I replied coldly. You had a daughter who worked 80 hours a week to build an empire. You had a daughter who could have bought you the world. But you threw me away because I did not wear flashy jewelry or brag about my bank account at your country club dinners. You worshipped a fraudulent family because they leased luxury cars, and you punished me because I refused to play your pathetic game of pretend. I pointed a single unwavering finger at the legal folder. Sign the paper, Dad. Thomas slowly reached forward. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the gold pen Richard had left behind. He did not argue. He did not threaten me. The illusion of his authority had been completely annihilated. He signed his name on the dotted line, his signature jagged and weak. He slid the document toward Catherine. She stared at it for a long moment, letting out one final agonizing sob before she picked up the pen and signed her name next to his. I stepped forward, picked up the executed severance agreement, and handed it to my lead corporate attorney. Escort them out of the building, I ordered, without breaking eye contact with my parents. If they ever attempt to bypass security again, have them arrested for trespassing. Yes, Director, the attorney replied smoothly. I did not wait to watch them leave. I turned my back on the two people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. I looked at Leo. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the police cruisers down on the street load Richard and Dominique into the back seats. Let us go home, Leo, I said gently. Leo turned around. The heavy burden of his toxic relationship and our parents' relentless manipulation was entirely gone from his face. He nodded, a genuine relaxed smile finally breaking through his exhaustion. He walked over to me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders in a tight, fiercely loyal embrace. I hugged him back, knowing we had just survived the worst our family had to offer. We walked out of the boardroom together. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind us, locking Catherine and Thomas inside, with their tears and their crushing regret. We bypassed the bustling executive assistants and stepped into the private glass elevator. I swiped my encrypted keycard, and the elevator began its smooth, rapid descent from the 85th floor. Through the glass walls, we watched the sprawling city pass by. I cannot believe you actually bought Vanguard Logistics before breakfast. Leo chuckled, shaking his head in absolute awe. You did not just beat them, Natalie. You completely erased them. Never underestimate a woman in sensible shoes, I replied, offering him a sly smile. The elevator doors slid open in the grand marble lobby. The high-powered executives and sharp-suited professionals parted ways for us, offering respectful nods as I walked past. The head receptionist stood straight, giving me a deferential smile as we pushed through the heavy revolving doors. We stepped out of the corporate fortress and into the bright, blinding city sunlight. The crisp morning air hit my face, and for the first time in 32 years, I took a deep breath that felt entirely free. The suffocating weight of my parents' expectations, the relentless insults, the need to shrink myself to avoid their criticism, all of it was gone. We walked toward the VIP valet zone. Leo looked around the crowded curb, scanning the line of vehicles. I guess we need to call a rideshare to get back to your sedan, he noted, pulling out his smartphone. I do not think that will be necessary, I said, reaching into the pocket of my tailored charcoal suit. I pulled out a heavy matte black metal key fob and handed it to the head valet. Bring it around, please. The valet nodded immediately. Right away, Director. Less than a minute later, the deep, guttural roar of a high-performance engine echoed through the concrete canyon of the financial district. A sleek, aggressive matte black sports car rolled up to the curb. It was a masterpiece of custom engineering, sitting low to the ground with tinted windows and terrifyingly beautiful lines. The car screamed absolute, unadulterated wealth. It was worth more than Richard's entire fraudulent commercial fleet. Leo dropped his phone. His jaw hit the pavement as he stared at the machine idling in front of us. He looked at the car, then looked at me, his eyes wide with sheer disbelief. You told Mom and Dad you drove a 5-year-old sedan. Leo stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the sports car. I do, I replied, walking toward the driver's side door. I use it for grocery runs and Sunday dinners. It keeps the gold diggers away. But today is a special occasion. Leo threw his head back and let out a loud, joyous laugh that echoed down the busy city block. He walked around to the passenger side, shaking his head in pure admiration. You are an absolute menace, Natalie. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the hand-stitched leather steering wheel. The digital dashboard flared to life. Leo got in beside me, buckling his seatbelt and running his hands over the luxurious interior. The toxic, fraudulent family that had tried to destroy us was currently sitting in police interrogation rooms and empty boardrooms, drowning in the catastrophic consequences of their own arrogance. They had chosen the illusion of power, and it had cost them their freedom. We chose loyalty, we chose the truth, and we had won everything. I shifted the car into gear, pressing my foot down on the accelerator. The engine roared like a caged beast suddenly unleashed. We pulled away from the towering glass skyscraper, leaving the wreckage of Vanguard Logistics and our toxic parents far behind us. We drove off into the bright city sunlight, speeding toward a future built on our own terms, enjoying the ultimate undeniable luxury of hard-earned freedom.